Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter stories. This video consists of 15 new Wendigo stories. First story. This story was shared by /Nathana, so credits to him. When I was young, I often spent parts of summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to the week-long stays of gardening, baking, late-night fires with mores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond, not far from her house, where I would sometimes go to swim. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife told him that they kept the Wendigo away, and to harm them would be unwise. Well, he didn't listen, and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It was a process that took some time, but he did not stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the protection of the frogs, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons, and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious than usual about it. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them, and put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked that old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it, originating in Algonquian legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I Googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about the stories she had told me, nor any references of frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the Wendigo of legends seemed very little like my grandmother's version. They were said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chuckled as I read it, almost a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had messed up the original tale. I changed residences this summer, moving to a newly built, 1,000 square foot, on each side, duplex on the edge of town. The other side is to be occupied by my landlady, who'd had the place built. However, she isn't scheduled to move the rest of her stuff in and begin living there for a couple of weeks. She's waiting for her lease to end. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the edge of town, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion of my new home and its proximity to a more natural setting. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can even see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn, which is meticulously carved out from the surrounding woodlands. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I prefer not to pay to run my air conditioning if I can help it, so I have every window open to catch a breeze. That means that I can hear them as clearly as if I were standing on the water's edge. It took a few days to get used to the noise, but I'm fine now, just like I was those summers when I was young. In fact, the noise has been comforting to me during the stress of the move. Tonight is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring at where the pond is, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still, and oppressively warm, but all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story had been a silly tale, a twisting of an old legend by irreverent storytellers. But for some reason, I have the most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do. I'm trapped. Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond my home, but I don't know if I'm going to be safe in here either. The frogs have stopped singing. Second story. This story was shared by u/Romanian_roulette, so credits to him. My uncle encountered a thing on my granddad's ranch. I would like to tell that this is my uncle's story, not mine. I will also be telling this through my uncle's perspective when the event occurred. I guess the whole event took place in the summer of '75. I was about 13. For the story to make sense, I'll start with context. My mother divorced my dad due to his issues with alcoholism, and quickly got custody over me and my 5 siblings. My dad was struggling greatly, so he made what was most likely the best decision, to move to a remote log cabin in Montana. He also had pretty serious mental problems. Because of his problems and the severity of them, my mom decided to never really let us stay at his cabin. She claims that she made a good decision, but I really feel like she accidentally made things worse, just isn't brave enough to own up to it. Anyway, my mother finally decided to let me fly up to my dad's cabin for a week, mostly because she felt like he needed someone in his life. Someone of his own flesh and blood to just be there for him. I wasn't very pleased with the decision at first, but my mother just told me to suck it up, so I did. The first day I arrived, my dad picked me up in his Ford 67 and we drove off. From the start, I could immediately tell that he was really bad off. He was very unkempt, he smelled like sweat and cheap deodorant, and he just gave off the vibe that he had practically hit rock bottom in life. But despite all that, I could tell he was happy to see me. For the rest of the day, we just took it easy. I helped him with some housework, and just got to know each other. Everything was calm as could be until the sun set. That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I heard a sound. It sounded like something scratching against the window, and I also remember a faint, deep, guttural sound. It honestly scared the shit out of me. But I was never a brave kid, so I just pretended it wasn't there and fell asleep after a while. The next morning, I decided to tell my dad about what I heard, to which he replied it was probably just some coyote or puma. I was pretty sure it wasn't a puma or coyote, but I went with it anyway. The next night, I heard the exact same thing I heard the night before, just louder. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew there was no way that the noise was from an animal, regardless of what it was. I begged my dad to let me sleep somewhere else, but he didn't seem to take me seriously. I guess he just thought I was joking or something. With my nerves practically screaming in fear, I tried to suck it up and sleep that night. But of course, it was back, and louder than ever. That's when I made the bold decision to look outside the window and hopefully, see that my concerns were over nothing. What I saw instead stuck with me permanently. I saw some humanoid creature on hands and knees, scratching at my window. Its body was thin and very lanky, and resembled a human with white skin aside from its head. Its head was the bloody skull of a buck. We even made eye socket contact. I screamed and shut my eyes. I only opened them once I heard my dad running in from his room. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. Thankfully, my dad started to believe me from this point on. It's been about 40 years since the incident, and I still remember all of it like a nightmare you can never forget. My dad passed away 7 years later, apparently from a breaking and entering gone wrong. I don't think I want to know what they meant by gone wrong. Thankfully, my dad is in a better place now, and I just hope that one day, I'll forget what happened and I'll be at peace too. Third story. This story was shared on our /nasleep. Wendigo's Spirit, long-lost journal of a Viking explorer. Last year I was hiking with a buddy of mine in the woods in eastern Newfoundland. For those who don't know, it's in the far eastern part of Canada. We are both originally from the Vancouver and have been avid hikers and campers for many years, traveling to all parts of Canada and currently working on our visas to America actually. While we were on a 2-day hiking trip camping where we saw fit, we stumbled off path as we thought we saw a cave farther off into the distance. After about 3 to 4 minutes of walking off the dirt path into the woods, we approached it, and indeed it was a cave. Knowing that caves are super neat but also very dangerous for many reasons, we just looked around for a bit before deciding if we should check inside if it's clear or not, as it would make a good spot to have camp for the night. Caves are home to many animals ranging small to large, bears, wolves to name a couple of the more dangerous animals to be exact. We eventually grabbed our flashlights from our backpacks and entered the cave entrance cautiously. The cave was pitch black, and once we had walked inside, noticing how deep it actually was. From the outside it looked like a 6 to 7 foot wide opening with about a 5-foot ceiling. But once you stepped inside, it had a good open space, I'd guess to be about 15 by 15, which was more than enough space for the two of us to set up camp and get a fire going for the night. In the back of the space was what looked like a small pathway of some sort. It was narrow and looked like the earth cracked it just enough for someone to walk through it. Where it led we had no clue, and I wasn't really wanting to find out at that moment. We were tired, looking to rest, and didn't feel like venturing off into the uncharted cave deeper and risking falling or getting hurt or stuck or God knows what else happens to people in caves. There was a faint water dripping noise down that dark pathway which echoed throughout the cave. Sounded spooky to me, but then again, maybe there's some fresh water nearby we can collect for tomorrow hike, I told my buddy. Once we set up our things, I told him I'd go check it out and see if I could find the source of the water, as I held out water containers in my now empty pack and my flashlight in my right hand. The pathway was twisted and narrow, and honestly it was just better that I went alone, plus I doubt my bud would have went with me anyways. He was tired as hell and was just ready to eat and go to sleep. I tucked and squeezed myself through with my pack and eventually found the source of the water after a minute or so walking deeper into the cave system. This cave kept going and going, I could not see further ahead, but I found the source, thankfully not too far in. There was a small stream that flowed down the rocky surface wall into a small puddle-like area, then disappearing into the rocks and earth. As I shunned my flashlight around, I happened to come across a pouch of some sort which was made of animal fur. I thought it was an animal at first and stood frozen in my tracks. I walked over to the fur ball and grabbed it. I realized the fur was just wrapped around something flat and hard in its center. As I looked, it seemed to have unraveled an old as hell looking leather book of some sort. I was really memorized about the find, but then realized how thirsty I was and took care of filling up our water containers first and bring this book and fur back with me back to our little campsite at the cave entrance. Once I got back, my friend had already gotten the fire going, which felt really nice as I sat down handing him his water. The night was on its way out with the sun starting to set. I told my friend about the book and let him take a look at it. He was always the history buff anyways, I just liked video games and hot chicks. He told me that this journal looked really old and is really surprised it in the shape that it's in. He pointed to the off shapes that were on the cover and on parts of the pages on the inside. They looked like runes, he mentioned. I didn't recall what runes were, and he told me that in fact that was the way of communication writing back in the Viking days. As he read, I mumbled to himself, "Dude, this is written in English, which is odd unless this person or Viking traveler was educated or had traveled more than most." He read on for a few minutes and told me to check it out as it mentioned this cave on one of the pages. He handed me the book and he laid back onto his mat and started to relax. I, on the other hand, was totally excited. Not only did I just find some ancient Viking journal in some cave in the middle of nowhere, but it was readable too. "This has to be worth some money," I said to him. He opened his eyes and just replied, "Dude, just read it or go to sleep." I smirked at him and I laid my back up against the side cave wall and started to read the notes from inside this journal. "If you are finding this journal, that means I am dead. My name is Bjorn Erling and the year is 1004 AD. I do not know the exact date of these entries as I have been stuck here in this cave for some time now. Our ship had arrived to the shores of this newfound land several weeks prior to these entries. There was 40 of us in total and have built a small village right off the shore past the wood line. We have an altercation with the natives of this land as they do not speak any language that I have heard before. They attacked our fort on the second week we are here. Several of our members have died and most of theirs too in the process. We can't seem to communicate properly with them and they keep attacking in the middle of the night, and we are trying our best to bessen our defenses. We have built walls around our village, but they always seem to find a way inside, picking us off one by one. They are not big people, quite small in fact, but there are many, and our next ship is not due here for another week or more. I was out hunting with a brother of mine in these woods. We went deeper than we have been as our people are hungry and we needed meat. The sun was dim and the colors above were quite pleasant to see when it was visible from all the trees overhead. We started hearing noises echoing around us in the woods. Not knowing what they were, we followed them. No sense at turning back, these sounds would have already startled off any catch we may have been tracking. As we continued deeper and deeper into the woods, the noises and snapping sounds became louder. We had no idea what was in store for us at the time, but we had to investigate. During our proustite, that when we both heard a familiar sounding voice speaking to us. It sounded like one of our other Viking brothers back at the village that had gone missing during one of the attacks for the natives. "Bjorn, help me, they have me trapped here and I cannot escape." My brother screamed, "By Odin, where are you?" Silence. The voices didn't reply. I gripped my sword handle on my waist and my brother held his bow with a firm grip. "Do you think that was really Kenjo?" "I don't know," I replied, "but we need to find out either way. It def sounded like him." We heard our brother speak again, but this time it spoke to use twice, but from different directions in front of us. "Levi, why did you not help me in the village? Hurry, I don't have much time." My brother Levi ran off to the left and motioned with his arm pointing for me to follow the other sound to the front right from our location. I nodded and readied my sword. After we had split up, I started to have a feeling of dread. An eerie feeling was washing over me. This felt off, none of this seemed right. The natives did not speak our language and that voice did sound like our brother Nook, but it was off in a way too. Not soon after, that's when I heard the screaming. The screaming of Levi. Rushing back in the direction I saw him walk to, I hurried as fast as I could, no longer caring about keeping the silence as I ran and screamed out to him, trying to find his whereabouts. Further in the distance is when I saw it. I cannot even call it a man. It was some kind of forest creature. It was skinny like it was starting and shaped like a man from what I could muster. Its long arms clawed my friend, dragging his now lifeless body further into the dark woods. This creature had antlers on its head like some kind of deer. We have gods like this back home. Had they followed us here to this new land and now punishing us for becoming Christians? I was in total shock, but there was no choice in the matter, and I was losing sight of them in the dark now, and there was a good distance still between us. I ran as fast as I could, but even in doing so still could not keep up with this creature dragging Levi. I picked up his bow off the grass along the chai and ended up finding this cave on this hillside. I just knew that creature had taken my brother into that cave. There was nowhere else in sight where it could have gone and disappeared to. Once in the cave, I explored as much as I could after making a makeshift torch with some fabric from my clothing on a nearby stick I had found. The space was tight. I found the bloody drag marks right away, so my hunch was correct. Levi was brought somewhere inside this cave system. I had gotten lost a couple of times within this cave. It is more than meets the eye, but always seem to find my way back to the water source as the constant dripping which echoes the labyrinth halls leads me back to here. I cannot leave him. I cannot leave my brother. I must avenge him and place his bow in his hand so that the Valkyries may take his soul to heaven or Valhalla to meet his family in paradise forevermore. I am writing this all down with the best of my knowledge in case I do not make it back out of this cave from which I ventured. Someone must know what happened to us. Someone must be led aware of this creature out in the woods. I hear my brother calling me now, far off, echoing off somewhere in this cave. I must end this log for now. If I return, I will update what I find. Goodbye for now. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Phillips612, so credits to him. I think I saw Wendigo through the train window. It is as the title states. I am fairly certain that I saw Wendigo out the window of the train. If that were the only event that happened, then I wouldn't have any reason to tell my story. In order to get into what happened, let me start off at the beginning of my day. It was a normal Saturday as far as I was concerned. I stayed up until about 3 a.m. playing the newest online mobile game with my brothers. Yes, I know, it is considered a sin to cheat by using my brother's screens to determine who the imposter is, but I'm not getting into that debate right now. I woke up not too long after 9 a.m., played on my phone a while, and then hopped out of bed, threw on the same clothes I had on the day before, and headed downstairs to the kitchen. I threw together my favorite breakfast food while my brothers both groggily dragged their feet to meet me. My twin brother, Gabe, decided to shower to wake himself up, while my younger brother, Zach, decided to partake in the feast of homemade waffles with peanut butter and chocolate milk. By the time Gabe was dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, Zach and I had already finished putting the dishes into our dishwasher and cleaned off the table. I had packed in advance and my train wasn't for a few more hours, so my brothers and I had pulled our phones out and began terrorizing the servers of Among Us for a little while. After we grew tired from the online insults and cyberbullying that we received for cheating, we played some Mortal Kombat on our PS4. It was a very relaxing morning, all things considered. As I prepared to collect my luggage and leave for the train station, I reiterated the food plans to my siblings. The roast is in a slow cooker, all you'll have to do is clean up. It is going to be finished at 6 today, and if you aren't sure if it's done, then shoot me a picture. I continued speaking over my Gabe's attempts of assuring me that they'd be fine without me. Remember, tomorrow is oven-baked chicken fingers and fries. After school Monday is burgers, and you can order anything you want for Tuesday, and pay a tip. I rushed my sentence as Gabe held the front door of our tiny rented house open for me. "Chrissy, we'll be fine, okay? Chill out, okay?" Gabe chuckled to himself. "You're right, you'll be fine. Do your homework. I love you guys. See you Wednesday." I called to them as I headed down the paved driveway and towards the bus stop down the road. "Hasta la vista, baby." As Zach yelled my favorite movie reference of all time at me, I couldn't help but smile. They'll be fine. I raised them well, I thought to myself. I looked at them waving in the open front door and gave them a very flat and stern expression. "I'll be back." I deepened my voice as best as possible before smiling and heading back towards the bus stop. My parents were extremely busy people all our lives. Gabe was born with a learning disability and required more attention from my parents than I needed. I had to grow up and mature faster to be able to take care of Gabe, as our mother was a full-time principal in our local school and a part-time student tutor, while my father worked as a warehouse manager full-time and was often working the midnight shifts. He worked those shifts due to the employees' reputations to be unproductive. He always said he needed to straighten them out. My father would sleep all day and my mother would work all day. I would always prepare Gabe's lunches and walk him to school, walk him home and make him dinner. I helped him with his homework. I read him bedtime stories. I tucked him into bed. I was always there for him. Zach was born a week before my 9th birthday with Gabe. By now Gabe had quickly matured, surprising everyone. He was potentially even smarter and more socially acceptable than I was, though he didn't have the same parenting skills that I had developed and therefore wasn't entirely confident in even turning on an oven or setting a microwave timer. Anyways, by the time Zach came around I was well aware that I'd have to raise him too. I so desperately wanted my mom and dad to be real parents for little Zach, to be there for him and be what Gabe and I never had. But I knew deep down inside that that wouldn't happen. By the time Gabe and I were 18 and Zach had just turned 9, the three of us moved out and into our own apartment. I wasn't even sure that our parents would notice Zach's absence, to be honest. They had no issues with us all moving in together. They said to me themselves that they knew Zach was better off with us than them. They said he was never supposed to be, which entirely angered me. Because of this, Gabe and I started to call Zach our miracle brother. Despite our age gap, the three of us were extremely close with one another. It was us three against the world. Nobody would change that. Then about a year ago, I fell in love with my old high school crush. His name is Brian. We were always close friends since grade 9, but as high school came to a close and we parted ways for university, we confessed our love. It was a very corny movie moment to me. Even through long distance we made our relationship work. Gabe and Zach were obviously jealous that Brian was taking all of my attention. They were afraid that Brian was going to take me away from them. All that aside, they liked my boyfriend. They were all friendly and had good laughs together. They were happy for us. So here I am, at the train station awaiting my train to my boyfriend on our first-year anniversary. I anxiously awaited the train, wondering with me when I got back. Maybe they were mad already. Or maybe they aren't upset at all. I talked myself into thinking that I was doing the right thing, even though my stomach was turning violently. I was feeling very nauseous. It had nothing to do with anything I ate. I had a horrible feeling. Something inside me was telling me that something bad was going to happen. I didn't listen to it at the time. I thought it was all just the nerves of traveling. I was just too excited to see Brian. The train was quite long. It went from my small little town of southern Ontario to the northern and frigid climate that is stereotypically portrayed as all of Canada. Overall, the trip to Brian's apartments was close to 12 hours. However, that includes the train ride along with the bus and the drive that Brian has to take from his apartment to where I arrive on the train and back to his apartment. I had boarded the train and been seated when one of the train staff members asked to scan my ticket. I quickly apologized for not being prepared and dug through my luggage to find my ticket. After ensuring that I was settled and asking if I had wanted any food or drink for the ride, the staff member had moved along down the aisle. I looked around the car, noticing only 3 other passengers before pulling out my laptop from my bag and popping my headphones into my ears. I sent a text to my parents informing them of my absence from my hometown for the next few days and threw on some YouTube. Gaming channels were always a favorite, but recently Gabe had gotten me hooked onto a game theory channel. I could sit there for hours watching the different conspiracy theories about video game lore, and for the first half of my trip, that's exactly what I did. The early winter sunset filled the skies with orange and pink highlights as I had decided to put my laptop away and watch the window with my music playlist on. I had always enjoyed listening to music on long trips, especially across the country. I tried to imagine cheesy movie scenes taking place in the open fields with slow songs playing and faceless couples slow dancing. Within about an hour after I first peered out my window, the snow had begun. At first it was a light flurry, hardly visible as the train sped along the tracks. Eventually it was blizzarding. Simply looking outside gave me chills, as I never enjoyed being in the snow. Snow is pretty, but from afar, I'd always say. I shivered underneath my thick leather jacket as the train came to a slow stop in a remote northern town. This was not my stop, as the train station itself was visibly the largest building in the entire town. Anyone could stand on one end of the town and see the other side down the road, even in the blizzard-like conditions that were present. As the train waited, I kept my eyes focused outside my window. No passengers had left the car and no additional passengers had boarded. I found this to be very strange, as the train needed to always stay on schedule. Little time was available for simply stopping. There must have been something wrong with one of the employees or the conductor, or possibly even the train itself. Attention passengers, we apologize for the delay. We will continue on our trip in 5 minutes. Once again, we apologize for the delay. We thank you for choosing to ride with us and enjoy your evening. The overhead speakers broke through my thoughts and pulled me back into reality. I simply looked around the car for a moment and then texted Brian to let him know of the 5-minute delay. When I looked back outside my window again was when I saw it. The tall figure was hunched over and with its back towards me. I could see the back of its white skull and its antlers broken and distorted. It was extremely frail, its limbs impossibly long and spindly. The creature was in the tree line across the town. Hardly any specific details were noticeably through the extreme snow, however I recognized right away the creature. Doubt had settled in almost as fast as the creature seemed to appear. Has it always been there? Was my mind playing tricks on me? It became more and more obvious the longer I gawked at it. How had I not noticed it until now? What the hell? I whispered under my breath. At the moment I was so quiet that I wasn't even sure I had said it out loud. Just as soon as I questioned, the creature whirled its head at a near 180-degree angle to face me. The black pits for eyes stared deep into my soul. This creature had heard me, and now this creature had seen me. I was sure of it. Its mouth unhinged and an animal's corpse fell out, blood spilling everywhere. Whatever this creature had been consuming was too mangled to determine what it really was. The train jolted to life and crawled across the tracks, gradually gaining speed. I was startled from the sudden movement and jumped nearly out of my seat. The creature only stared as I sped off. I scrambled to get my laptop out of my bag and reconnect it to the train's Wi-Fi. I spent the last 2.5 hours of my trip researching the creature. This is where I had learned of its name, Wendigo. This creature had been a part of native folklore for many generations. I nearly couldn't hold my dinner in when I read about the stories of cannibals becoming Wendigos hundreds of years ago. After reading other people's close encounters online, I was more and more convinced that what I saw was real. I was ready to move on and forget about my encounter with the Wendigo by the time I stepped off the train. I practically fell into Brian's arms and broke down, a mixture of fear and emotions of sadness and loneliness overtaking me all at once. I was grateful to be there with him, in his arms when I needed him most. I told him about my encounter with the cryptid on the drive back to his apartment. "I believe that you definitely saw something," he began, his doubt unintentionally present in his voice. "I just don't believe that a creature like that exists is all. Like, how come the only solid proof of its existence are tall tales and folklore?" "I don't know, Brian." I quietly looked to my feet. He reached one of his hands off the wheel and held mine firmly and reassuringly. I don't know what it is, I guess. It feels real to me." "Well, that's good enough for me," he said calmly. "That's enough reason for me to keep you safe." His classic cute grin formed on his face, revealing only a few of his nearly perfect white teeth. "Oh? You need a reason to keep me safe?" I jokingly said, as if he had said something offensive. "Well, no. He stumbled over his words. Who?" I made it comically clear that I was not believing him. Brian had managed to make me forget all about my terrible experience hours ago. We were laughing and joking around as he pulled into his parking space in his apartment complex. The building itself hadn't been very tall, only about 10 stories. The building itself was nearly completely surrounded by dark Canadian woods. His town wasn't very large, only about 8,000 residents. Beautiful lush evergreen forests surrounded the little city, with nearly every house having its own tree in the front lawn. Sparkling white snowflakes gently fell around me as I stepped out of Brian's car. The parking lot was lightly covered in snow before I had managed to make it to the entrance of the building. Brian, like the gentleman he is, carried my luggage from the car into the apartment. He was talking about one of the regular customers at his fast food part-time job when I cut him off. "Listen," I said in a hushed whisper. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Goosebumps formed all over my body. Someone was watching us, I could feel it. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "I don't hear anything, Chris." "Exactly. It's so quiet." There weren't any noises around. Not a single sound. Only the eerie dead silence. Is it always this quiet? In the middle of the night? Yeah, it is. Brian wasn't making me feel any better. "What's wrong, Chrissy? You still spooked? Let's just go inside. I don't like it out here." I clung onto his arm and rushed towards the front doors. Once inside and in the elevator, I told him what I read online. I explained that the absence of any natural noises or wild animals typically means there's a predator around. With his apartment complex close to some dark woods, I wasn't very calm. I also told him how I felt that we were being watched from something in the woods. "Babe, your nerves are probably just shot." He held me close to him, trying to calm me down. "I promise you're safe here." "It's gone." "I promise." He drifted off. That night I dreamed that the creature had followed us. I saw from its point of view as it followed our car towards Brian's apartment. I saw as it watched us get out from the car and head inside. And I saw as it crawled into bed behind me, holding me in place. "Don't move," it hissed, its hot breath on my ear. I woke up in a cold sweat. Brian was sound asleep beside me, looking peaceful as ever. I went to the kitchen and got myself a glass of water. I put on my warm fuzzy housecoat over top of my pajamas and stood outside on the balcony. Some fresh air would do me good, I thought to myself. It was 3:20 in the morning, and there I was on the balcony of the 7th floor, contemplating a cigarette. I wanted to quit ever since I had taken ownership of my brothers, but on that balcony I felt as though I had so desperately needed one. Feeling ashamed of myself for even considering one, I threw the only cigarette I had off the balcony. I needed to get a hold of myself before I returned home. I couldn't let Zach see me like this. Gabe would scold me if he were here, I thought. Wiping tears off my face, I looked around the tree line. I was just starting to regain my composure when I noticed something out of place. In the tree line was the deer skull. The horrid creature's body was undoubtedly attached to it. It just stared at me. I whirled around and nearly dove inside Brian's apartment. I slammed the balcony glass door shut and locked it. As I headed to make sure the front door was locked, Brian intercepted me, forcing a scream out of me. "What's the matter, Christina?" Brian held me by my arms. I wouldn't stop wailing. All that I could get out was "It's following me" in between the sobs. He held me in a close hug until I was calm enough to explain my nightmare and about the creature I saw mere moments ago. "Stay here," he said as he headed towards the balcony and took a look outside. I watched as he unlocked the door and stepped onto the balcony. A chill went down my spine, but not because of the wintry night air flowing into the apartment. Brian just stood there, staring at one spot. After a long pause, he slowly backed into the apartment, not taking his eyes off the creature outside. I knew he saw it. I knew he believed me. I could see it in his face. His eyes wide with fear, his mouth only slightly ajar. Without looking at me, he said, "The parking lot is in the back of the complex. Get your things. We can't stay here." "Are you crazy? That thing is outside. It's following me." I nearly yelled, panic setting in. I felt as though I was going to vomit. "That thing. It told me." Brian was in terror. "I don't know how, but it told me that it was going to come inside." I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "We have to go," he urged. I grabbed his hand and he grabbed his keys, and we rushed out the front door. We ran to the elevator and rapidly hit the down button. I decided that taking the stairs was faster and bolted through the door towards the stairs, Brian following right behind me. Reaching the stairwell, I looked to the bottom before descending the stairs. About halfway down the first flight, I heard heavy tapping coming from the bottom. I leaned over the banister and saw the undead deer creature making its way up the stairs. Brian nearly bumped into me as I spun around and sprinted up the stairs crying and screaming. He followed my lead without question as I headed towards the elevator, doors just beginning to open. We both cramped ourselves into the elevator and Brian rapidly pushed the ground floor button. Just as the double doors slowly closed, we saw the stairwell doorway open and the animal's snout making its way towards us. We held each other, Brian verbally praying and me regretting most of my past life's choices. Ground floor and parking, the elevator dinged, cueing us to make our hasty escape. We ran like our lives depended on it, because in those long moments, they did. On our way to Brian's car, I slipped and fell into the snow. Brian, who was ahead of me, turned around and prepared to help me up. "No, go! Start the car! Go!" I yelled frantically as I slowly made my way to my feet. He spun around and ran towards the car again. I took one step forward and fell to my knees, pain pulsing through my ankle. I loudly groaned in pain, clenching my teeth. I managed to get to my feet and half-limp half-jogged to the car. Just as I closed the passenger door, the front doors of the apartment complex were violently torn from their hinges. The creature held nothing back as it sprinted on all fours towards the car. "Hang on." Brian shifted the car into drive and floored it. Normally the wintry road conditions would have evoked anxiety in me, but right now I felt as though Brian wasn't driving fast enough. I kept my eyes glued to the rear view mirror, watching the creature gallop towards us, its skinny form seemingly moving in unnatural angles with each step. "Are you all right?" Brian asked of deep concern, his eyes trained on the road ahead. "I think that I broke my ankle," I managed to get out in between breaths. He cursed under his breath. "I don't think we can get you to a hospital with that thing on our asses," Brian thought out loud. "Did you bring your phone?" I asked him. "I'm going to call the police." "Damn it, no, I left mine at the apartment," Brian said plainly. I quietly sobbed as I too had left my phone in the rush. "We are going to die tonight, aren't we?" I said out loud, not wanting an answer. "No, babe, don't say that. Things are going to be fine, we'll make it out of this." "Will we? Will we actually, Brian?" I yelled at him. Tears streaming down his face too. He was terrified, just like me, and yet, he was trying to protect me and keep me calm. I stumbled an apology in between sobs, but Brian cut me off. "It's gone." He slowed the car to a stop and looked all around. "Where did it go?" "It's gone. Where did it go?" I too began to look around, unease settling in. I'm not sure what was more horrific, seeing the creature pursue us or not being able to see it, but feel that it was still there. We sat there in the car for a long while, just looking around desperately. In the distance down the road, I noticed headlights. I pointed them out to Brian and he flashed his high beams off and on. The car pulled over to the side of the road and Brian got out to talk to the driver. I bit my lip, not enjoying the idea of Brian getting out of the car. "Please, call the police, we need an ambulance too," I heard Brian talk to the driver. Just as Brian made his way back to the car, the creature came out of the darkness and took him in its grasp. It happened so quickly. He was just gone, only a few drops of blood on the ground to prove that he was even there. The man in his car across the road screamed and sped off. I sat there, stunned and no doubt in shock. The monster rammed into my passenger side door head first, breaking me from my trance. It broke through the window and shoved its face towards me. I struggled against my seatbelt and repeatedly kicked it in its hollow skull. It caught my leg in its mouth and clamped its jaws down hard. I screamed from the pain, blood pooling around my wounds. I heard the horrific sound of my leg being bitten through as the beast crunched through bone. All I could do was scream. Biting down on my other leg, it pulled me through the window. I screamed for my life, but it was no use. With ease it had flung me face first into a nearby tree, and everything went black instantly. My entire body seared with pain as blurry images of men and women in police uniforms and rescue uniforms loaded me onto a bed and into an ambulance. I was drifting in and out of consciousness. When I had finally come to full consciousness, I was in a hospital bed and hooked up to countless pieces of machinery. I had a feeding tube and an oxygen tube in me. My arm had N4 in it, heartbeat monitors attached to my chest. The nurse reading my file gasped when she saw me awake and rushed out of the room. The PA system announced several doctors to where I assumed I was located. Within minutes the doctors were unhooking the feeding tube and oxygen tube, as I had no longer needed them. "We expected you to be in a coma for at least another month," one of the doctors explained to me after the tubes were removed. "Another month?" I asked before clearing my throat. It still felt as though I had those plastic tubes shoved down my throat. "You were out for 6 weeks. You were in a very brutal car accident. While waiting for the emergency vehicles to arrive, you were attacked by an animal. It was a very horrible scene." I blankly stared at him. "Don't you remember Christine?" He cocked his head to the side and gave me a quizzical look. It's Christina," I corrected him. "And no, I don't," I lied. I laid there for hours remembering the horrible nightmare that happened to me nearly 2 months ago. My whole body ached and pulsed with pain. I could hardly move. I thought about Brian for the longest time. I assumed he had to be dead, but he had shown up later that night. "I came as soon as I heard that you were awake," he told me as he leaned over and kissed my forehead. "After the creature had attacked me, it went for you. I watched as it threw you against the tree. I tried to pull it off you, but it threw me away. It told me that it wanted you. It told me that you saw something that you weren't supposed to see," Brian explained. By the time the police and ambulances showed up, the creature had already left. I never saw it leave, it was just somehow gone. "I rode with you in the back, the officers recorded it as a bear attack. They didn't believe my story." Brian went on to say that he was administered into the hospital for a day with only flesh wounds and stitches. He said that he and my brothers and parents visited me nearly every day or so. "My parents came?" I asked, stunned. He nodded, giving me a half smile. "In fact, they gave me a call on my way here. They're headed up with your brothers. They said that they'll try to get here before breakfast. When they got the call that you were awake, they pretty much dropped what they were doing and hopped in the car." I teared up and smiled. "What did you tell them about what happened?" "The police told them what they thought happened. I went with it because I want them to like me." I giggled. Then I struggled to sit up. Brian rushed over to give help and sit me up. I reached down to scratch my leg, but I couldn't quite find the spot. "Hey hun, can you help me? I've got an itch and I can't reach it, I'm too sore to be reaching down." I looked at Brian and he smiled back at me. "Sure babe, whereabouts?" "My left leg, just below the kneecap." Brian went pale suddenly. "What's wrong?" I removed the blankets as a wave of adrenaline washed over me. both of my legs were gone from just above the knees. I was still coping with my new handicap when my younger brothers, accompanied by my parents, rushed into the room and nearly knocked the wind out of me in a big hug each. "Guys, I'm okay. I'm alright." I laughed a little out loud from pure happiness. "They said you might not wake up," Zach sobbed as he held me close. They were talking to Mom and Dad about having to pull the plug on you," Gabe said grimly. "Ah, guys. Doctors aren't always right. Look. I'm fine." Then I looked to my parents, both of them clearly holding back tears. "We love you so much, Christina. Don't you ever go thinking otherwise." My mom's voice on the verge of breaking. "Come back and live with us, okay? You'll be needing someone to look after you." My father chimed in. "I'll have Gabe dash," I started. "We've moved back in with Mom and Dad," Gabe said, giving me a warm smile. I looked over to Brian, who gave me a "you should listen to them" look with a smile to top it off. "I'll come back home." When they let me out of here, I couldn't finish. I cried of happiness. My parents loved me after all. My parents embraced me in a hug each, and my dad stepped out of the room to talk to one of the nurses. "How was the drive up?" I asked my mom, wiping a tear from my face. "Oh, not too bad. The first few hours there was a little snow, but once we passed through Oshawa, Toronto area, it wasn't too bad." "Oh, nice," I trailed off. Oh, Chrissy." Zach grew excited. "I saw something really cool on the drive up." "Oh, that's right. Go on, tell your sister," my mom encouraged. "It was a bear-looking creature, but it was wearing this animal skull. I think it was a deer's skull. And the bear looked real skinny and tall. Isn't that something?" My mom looked at me. I just looked to Brian. I knew I was probably as pale as he was in that moment. "I didn't see anything," Gabe stated matter-of-factly. I ignored him. "Yeah, it was freaky. Gabe missed it." "I saw it too. I don't think your father saw it." My mother's voice grew distant as I stared at Brian. "Are you okay? You don't look so good," someone asked me, but I wasn't sure who. "Maybe you all should go home early. I'll bring Chrissy back down when she's out of the hospital," Brian said. "You all have lives to get back to." "Oh, Brian. That's so sweet of you, but we'll pass. We've got a hotel room nearby, and we took the boys off school," my mom said in her fake cheery voice. "Mom," I stated in the most serious tone I could muster up, "listen to me very carefully. You have seen something that you weren't meant to see. That thing. It's on its way right now." I teared up. "It's coming to find you. And little Zachy." Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Colin7 He Kid, so credits to him. I think I may have seen a Wendigo. So this is very confusing, but bear with me. I was in my house with tea and a book. I have a large window seat on the second floor, and I was chilling right there. I have a small 2-story cabin in the woods. A long driveway, about a half-mile, leads down to the main road, not a highway, mind you. I enjoy taking hikes, hunting, fishing, and just enjoying nature in general. I was looking out into the forest to see if I could find any cool birds, when I heard a noise. A rustle in the bushes brought my attention toward my neighbor's cattle pen. My neighbor's house can only be accessed by the same long road, and they have a farm with 3 cattle, 2 cows and a bull, 12 chickens, and 2 pigs. A large barn sits in the middle of all the pens. The bush rustled again. Thinking it was a bear, I was worried it would take one of the pigs and drag them into the woods. This has happened once already, sadly. I grabbed my old hunting rifle. I was going to attempt to fire the gun in the air and scare the creature, no reason to harm it. But what I saw made me think twice. I walked out onto my large back porch, fired in the air. The loud noise pierced my eardrums and chased me to flinch. The second the rifle fired, a dull reddish blur appeared, sprinting into the neighbor's pig pen. It got on all fours and grabbed the poor animal with its mouth, then sprinted back into the forest, with the swine clutched between its jaws. Holy shit! I yell, after seeing this. The 6th story. This story was shared by /JL Goodwin 1990, so credits to him. Be careful where you run off the road. That is one hell of a rainstorm. I looked up from the magazine I'd been reading to stare out the floor-to-ceiling windows lining the front wall of the service station. The sound of the downpour had been our soundtrack for the last 5 or 6 hours on shift, but it had turned extremely ferocious in the last hour or so. I could see the rain slashing across the pavement, driven by the wind. It lashed against the glass, making it extremely difficult to see out of. Let's just hope it doesn't cause another power outage, I thought, before answering. You're not kidding, Ralph, I said, feigning interest. We had plenty of driving rainstorms here in the Pacific Northwest, so much so that by now, after almost a decade and a half of living here, it had just become a regular occurrence to me. Ralph saw right through my charade, stepping to the other side of the counter and shooting me a look. You don't understand, Mick, and it may be because you haven't lived here that long, or you're just too young. I haven't seen a rainstorm like this since at least 1954. He used his hand to slick back his salt and pepper hair. Ralph was the owner of the gas station and repair shop I'd taken a cashier's job at, and had been the owner ever since his father had passed and left it to him when he was just 18 years old. Even though he was pushing 90, long past the age many people retired at, he seemed to be just like the damn Energizer Bunny and kept going. I'd never admit it, but I secretly hoped I could be like that when I was his age. He leaned over the counter, fumbling for a second before pulling out a battered and very well-worn portable radio. After a moment of setting up the antenna and fumbling with the dials, the constant blare of static was changed to the faint sound of a man speaking. And if you're just tuning in, ladies and gentlemen, we have an update on the storm currently swirling over central and southern Oregon. According to meteorologists, this winter has been one of the rainiest we've had in decades, which, on the one hand, is good for the forests after the fires which swept through the area a few years ago. On the other, it is causing multiple areas to become laden with power outages and automobile accidents. We're officially advising that, unless it is absolutely necessary, to please stay inside and avoid traveling until the worst of the storm has passed. In other news, the Seattle Mariners dash. Ralph turned the radio off, looking at me. You got anywhere to be tonight, Mick? He asked. I shook my head. Ever since Rudhine, my girlfriend, had decided to take a break in our relationship, I hadn't really had much to do over the winter, especially with my friends off in different states for college. He nodded, leaning to place the radio back under the counter. Then I'm going to suggest we stay open for a few more hours than usual, until the worst of this passes. I don't want you getting into an accident out there. I'll make sure to give you a little overtime pay for it. Of course, I nodded gratefully, with inflation being the way it was. making everything from rent to car payments more expensive. I would take extra pay any day of the week. I'm perfectly okay with that, I declared, causing the old man to chuckle. Good, he said. Now go back to the fridges and get us each a Coke. It's on the house. Allowing myself a small smile, I slid off the stool and left the cashier's island, heading to the refrigerators lining the back wall. I opened the glass door of one and pulled out 2 glass bottles of Mexican Coke. Ralph had gotten me hooked on the variation of the soda which used pure cane sugar instead of corn syrup, saying it was the closest to how it had used to taste in his youth. As I stepped back into the island and closed the partition behind me, I spared a look outside. What the? There was a figure running up the 2-lane road towards the station. What the hell is someone doing running outside in this crap? I dropped the 2 bottles on the counter, then tapped my knuckles on it to get Ralph's attention. Hey Ralph, get a load of this, I called, pointing out the windows. He started as his gaze followed my finger to the figure. What the? He mumbled, then spoke louder. What the hell is someone doing out in this mess on foot? Took the thoughts right out of my head, I thought. Before I had a chance to answer, the figure jogged under the awning for the gas pumps and across to the front door. He practically tore the door open, causing a howl of wind and large amount of rain to invade the store and spread across the tiled floor. The figure stepped inside, letting the door close behind them and the wind to dull back to a soft howl, bending almost in half and breathing heavily. I could see now it was a man, one who was soaked through to the bone. I could also tell he was extremely wealthy. The waterlogged black suit he had on looked like something you'd see in a Beverly Hills tailor shop, something you'd have to shell out over $4,000 or $5,000 for. His shoes looked like genuine crocodile leather or something, and what looked like a diamond stickpin was stuck into his tie. Finally, he stood up and looked at us. He looked utterly exhausted, but behind it was something that set me on edge. His eyes were full of panic. Ralph stepped forward. Can I help you in any way, sir? He asked, trying to seem pleasant and not perturbed. The man held up a finger, still trying to breathe in great lungfuls of air and coughing out rainwater. You've got to help me, sir, he began to stammer out. I was trying to drive up from San Francisco to Seattle, when I got lost in the storm and took a wrong turn. My car went off the road about 10 or 12 miles back, and I couldn't get it out. His eyes held a more frantic pleading now. Please, my wife and 2 kids are still in the car. They wouldn't have made it all the way in the storm. I told them I'd go for help. Ralph raised his hands in a placating manner. Okay, sir, okay. Just try and calm down. He shot a glance out the window, then turned to me, his eyes serious. Mick, go in the back to the phone and try and get a hold of the police while I speak more to our guest here. Obediently, I flipped back the island partition and walked quickly to the back room, where the store's inventory computer and landline phone were. I picked up the handset, hoping to hear a solid dial tone greet my ears. Instead, all I got was dead air. Great, the storm knocked the landlines out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone, letting out a groan as I saw that no reception bars were displayed. Of freaking course, I grumbled, then headed back to the front of the store. No good, Ralph, the landline's dead, and I'm not getting any cell signal in this storm. I held up my phone and wiggled it for emphasis. The man became more frantic, almost clutching at Ralph's overalls. Please, we have to do something, Ralph. I can't leave them out there all night. I admired Ralph's calmness as he gently pulled the man's hands off him. He let out a resigned sigh. Okay, sir, my employee, and I will go back with you to get your family. Tomorrow morning, I'll have him run out with the tow truck to bring your car back here. Does that sound okay?" The man began to cry tears of relief, mixing in with the rainwater all over his face. "Thank you. Thank you. Never will I say anything bad again about you rural folks." I raised an eyebrow at his choice of words, but held my tongue. "What's your name, sir?" Ralph asked him. "Charles." "Charles Winsome," he replied, reaching out and shaking his hand. "Well, Charles, unfortunately my employee's car won't make it on the back roads, so we'll have to take my wrecker, and since it's a regular cab, it'll be a little cramped on the drive back." The man, Charles, shook his head. "That's perfectly fine, sir," he said. Ralph pulled a ring of keys from his belt and tossed them to me. "Mick, go get the truck and bring it around to the front door. I'll lock up and figure out where Mr. Winsome's car is." Nodding, I left the counter and jogged out into the connected garage bays. Ralph's tow truck, an extremely well-kept 1952 Dodge Power Wagon, sat in the far bay, the two-tone black and tan paint glinting in the overhead lights and its tow hook swinging lazily. I hit the button to open the bay door, causing the wind and rain to roar, and as I hopped behind the wheel and fired it up, the flathead inline-six engine roaring in the bay. Jamming the truck into first gear, I pulled it out into the storm, hopping out into the driving rain to shut the bay door behind me before pulling the truck up next to the front door of the store. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw Ralph and Charles dash out into the storm. Charles reached the truck first, pulling open the passenger door and climbing into the middle seat of the cab. Ralph followed a moment after, heaving himself into the passenger seat. As he slammed the door, something on his face gave me pause. There was a look there that I had only seen once or twice in the entire time I'd known him. Tension. Tension and worry. He looked to me, nodding. "Start heading east on State Highway 38, he said simply, before turning his head to look out the windshield, past the rapidly flicking windshield wipers. The man usually couldn't shut up, even in bad situations. The fact he spoke so briefly made me feel increasingly on edge. The man told him something he didn't like hearing. I shook my head as I pulled the wrecker out onto the road. The hell had that thought come from? I pushed the thought away, focusing on keeping the truck in its proper lane as I squinted out past the rain, which the old, vacuum-powered wipers did a poor job keeping off the glass. For what seemed to be 15 or 20 minutes, but felt more like 2 or 3 hours, we drove in silence, only broken by the roar of the truck's engine and the lashing rain. At this point, I couldn't even tell you where on the long stretch of rural highway connecting Reedsport and most of the coast to Interstate 5 we were. I hadn't seen a single other vehicle on the road, not even a cop car, which made me feel increasingly isolated. My mind began to drift off as I kept my foot down on the accelerator. It almost feels like we're the last 3 people alive on Earth, I thought. That thought was shattered as Charles pointed out the windshield ahead of us. "There, that's where I turned off," he exclaimed. I leaned forward, using a rag on the dash to wipe away some of the steam which the truck's defroster couldn't chase away. In perfect conditions, it would have been something which nobody would have glanced at. It was so perfectly camouflaged among the trees lining the side of the road. In the downpour, it was close to impossible. I'd have driven straight by if it hadn't been pointed out to me. I slowed, and even though I saw nobody else coming, put on my blinker out of a force of habit. I could now see deep tire tracks which had been formed into the dirt and mud recently. Those must be from Charles. I shook my head. trust a city slicker to think that road would take him anywhere near civilization. I shot a glance at Ralph as I eased onto the gas and turned the truck onto the dirt road. I could barely see him in the dim glow of the truck's gauge lights, but I could tell his jaw was set tightly, his eyes flicking from one side of the tree line to the other. What the hell has the old man so on edge? I wondered. He caught me staring and nodded, motioning to keep going. I reached down and set the truck into four-wheel drive, then flicked on the high beams before slowly beginning down the road. The trees rapidly closed in over our heads, melting the already dark, stormy night into an almost inky blackness only banished away by the headlights. I massaged the accelerator gently, even with four-wheel drive. I knew a dirt road like this would be easy to get stuck on in this weather, and the last thing we needed was for the rescuers to get stuck as well. Occasionally, a pine or fir tree branch would scrape against the roof of the truck, making an almost sickening sound, before banging off the tow assembly and hook on the back. There was one thing I was grateful for. The rainstorm seemed to be letting up somewhat. It was becoming easier to see out the windshield, and the truck was eating up the dirt ruts. I followed the tire tracks I saw in the mud, knowing, like breadcrumbs, they'd eventually lead us to their source. And as we rounded a corner, I spied it. In the bright yellow beam of the headlights, I could see the back end of the car peeking out from the side of the road where it had gone off. It was, indeed, an expensive car. It looked to be a brand new Bentley Flying Spur, something I'd only seen in YouTube videos and in car magazines. The hazard lights were on, lighting up the surrounding area in bright orange pulses. Charles let out a relieved sigh. Ah, thank God. I hope Desiree and the kids. He trailed off. Charles, what's the matter? Ralph asked him, but as we drew closer, I already saw what had made his sentence die away. Both of the rear doors, along with the front passenger door, stood wide open. I could see the expensive wood and leather was soaked from the rain, meaning they'd been left open for a fair while, at least. The overhead dome light of the car was on, and from this distance, I saw no movement inside. What the fuck? I whispered out as I brought the truck to a halt about 5 or 10 feet from the car. All at once, Charles turned and began pushing against Ralph. Let me out, he yelled, his voice almost painfully loud in the truck's cabin. Easy, Charles, easy, wait a minute. Ralph exclaimed, trying to hold the man back, but he'd already reached across to the door handle, pushing it open and beginning to crawl across him. A moment later, he dropped out of sight, falling to the ground with a squelching sound from the mud. I could hear him swearing as he fought to get to his feet. I began to open the driver's door when Ralph grabbed my arm. Mick, stay close to the truck, he said, in more of a stern voice than I was used to. I shot a look at him, his warning sending a small shiver up my spine. Why? I asked cautiously after a moment. He didn't answer me, only pushing the half-open passenger door all the way open and hopping out. After a moment's hesitation, I leaned down, fumbling under the driver's seat for what I knew the old man stashed there. My hand came up a moment later holding an old, well-oiled and well-taken-care-of revolver. I had been sent out on several tow jobs when Ralph or the other mechanics couldn't do it, sometimes to less than ideal towns around the area. I'd been told it was there if I needed to protect myself. Now kind of seems like one of those times, I thought as I twisted the door handle and launched myself out into the rainy night. The storm had definitely let up a bit now. The rain had slacked off, though it still hit my face and exposed hands hard enough to sting slightly. I tucked the revolver into my waistband, slamming the door and fighting my way through the mud and muck which had once been the road. Stepping around to the front, I positioned myself between the two headlights and looked around. I could tell instantly that something felt off. Even during a rainstorm, you can still hear the sounds of the forest all around you. Animal calls, crickets and cicadas, things of that nature. But aside from the wind and rain, I couldn't hear anything besides the rumble of the wrecker's engine idling. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, and it made another shiver surge through me. Attempting to focus, I took a few steps forward, seeing Ralph come into view in my peripheral vision. Charles had already made it to the back of the Bentley, reaching out and gripping the rear quarter panel with one muddy hand. "Desiree?" I heard him call. "Maxwell, Chloe?" He stuck his hand into the car's cabin for a moment, then pulled it back out. "They wouldn't have left the car," he exclaimed, looking back at us as if we had the answers he searched in vain for in his own mind. "Where the hell did they go?" I saw him look further down the road, then out into the forest. "Desiree," he screamed, cupping his hands over his mouth. "Max, Chloe." After a moment, he began down the steep hill. The car leaned halfway over onto the forest floor below. "Charles, wait!" Ralph yelled after him, but he seemed to either not hear him or ignored him. For a moment, Ruthine's face flashed through my mind, her platinum blonde hair soaked with rain and her blue eyes peering around worriedly. I knew how I'd feel if I'd come across my car in a state like this, with the passenger door wide open after leaving her safely inside. The emotions the image carried pushed away Ralph's warning, along with any negative feelings I had about the wealthy man, and I struggled forward until I, too, reached the Bentley. I heard the quiet rumble of its engine still running, and spared a glance inside, seeing no sign of life among the brown leather and wood. Then, I reached down to my belt and pulled a waterproof flashlight from it. Clicking it on, I shone it down to where Charles had gone. I saw him, standing among the ferns and looking around frantically. He looked up at me, then motioned for me to join him. "Come on, I see footprints down here." "We'll find them quicker with the flashlight." Without thinking, I braced myself and began sliding down the hill. "Mick, wait!" I heard Ralph shout. I heard a hint of desperation in his voice, along with something else. Was that fear? It made me hesitate as I continued sliding down. I'd never heard the man have any fear in his voice before. But it was already too late. I'd reached the bottom of the hill, coming to a stop next to Charles. He pointed down, and I aimed my flashlight, seeing an adult's footprints, along with two smaller sets clearly visible in the soft earth, filled with water. I followed them with the beam, seeing they led away into the woods. I spared a quick glance back up at Ralph. He hadn't moved from the top of the hill, still looking down at us. I couldn't see his face in the dark, but his body seemed tensed up. It made mine do the same, and I looked around, for a moment feeling like there were eyes on me. But I saw nothing. "Come on," Charles said, tapping my shoulder and beginning to follow the tracks. I let out a deep breath, then pulled the revolver from my waistband. Gripping it tightly in my wet hand, I followed, slowly. We only made it about 50 feet into the forest when he stopped. "Wah!" I heard him breathe out, and hearing the fear and confusion in his voice, I hurried to his side. When I reached him, I again aimed my flashlight beam down, and felt a similar sense of confusion wash over me like a wave. The 3 sets of footprints ended abruptly here. I flashed the beam around, before aiming it back down. They didn't go off in any other direction, and unless all three had pulled a Danny Torrance and walked backwards in their own footsteps, they hadn't gone back. It's like they just disappeared. The thought made the uneasy feeling I had welling up inside me amplify, and I again was overcome with the feeling of being watched. This time, however, it did not go away when I looked up. If anything, it intensified. Tendrils of fear began to creep up on me over the uneasiness, though I couldn't tell why. That's when Charles spoke. "Hey, is it ever this still out in the woods?" he whispered to me. I shook my head. No, it's never this still." I looked around. "Something's not right here, man. We should go back to the truck. Try and call the cops again, get them out here. They'll have an easier time finding your wife and kids than we will." He looked at me, a look of despair and fear etched across his face, but eventually he nodded at me, and we turned and began to slog back towards the hill. Daddy, both of us stopped dead in our tracks at the sound. It had been quiet, almost too quiet to hear over the rain and wind, but the stillness around us allowed it to bleed through. I felt the strongest chill go up my spine, forcing me to let out a gasp of air. I saw Charles turn around rapidly. For a few moments, there was silence, then, Daddy, that had been a different voice, a little girl's voice. "Max?" Charles whispered out into the night. "Chloe?" Silence for a few more seconds. "Help us, Daddy," came the whisper from somewhere off to our right. Charles came a low, husky woman's voice from off to our left. I suddenly felt as though I was a cowboy in a Western movie, who had just realized he'd stupidly walked blindly into an ambush. Or some dumbass in a horror movie who went to investigate a noise, knowing they'd likely get disemboweled. I couldn't tell why, but the three voices which kept whispering at us just sounded wrong. They sounded off. It wasn't by much, but just enough to be noticeable. Apparently, not to Charles, though. He turned to me and snatched the flashlight out of my hands, then began to run back the way we'd come from. "Sweetheart, kids, wherever you are, follow my voice," he screamed. Suddenly, I heard Ralph's voice loudly and roughly call out from behind me. "Mick, get the fuck back up here, now!" His use of the F-bomb startled me. The man was old-fashioned to a T, and that included rare, if any, use of swearing. It sent a new staple of fear through me, and I began to back up towards the sound of his voice. "CH Charles?" I called out, but just as quickly, the sound died in my throat as I saw a faint light appear, first from one direction, then another, until I saw multiple faint blue lights coming in our direction from everywhere out in the forest. I felt my jaw drop open as I stared at what emerged into view. "What the fuck?" I cried out. If you're old enough to remember analog television, you'll remember how, when nasty storms came through the area, it would cause the screen to fuzz in and out with static and snow. How, faintly through it, you could sometimes see the figures of the people on the screen, just an outline visible. That's what they looked like. I could see the faint, human-like outlines as they almost seemed to glide forward just above the ground. But there were no definitive features to them. Instead, their bodies seemed to comprise of actual static. I could see the flickering lines move from one side of their figure to another. I couldn't see any eyes either, but I got the definite feeling they could see just fine. In my mind, I'd pictured Wendigos or something appearing from the tree to leap at us when the feeling of fear had washed over me. But the feeling these things gave off was infinitely worse. I have never felt such dread and fear in my life as I watched them approach us. that was when I began to hear the whispering. It was soft, like a lover calling to their partner from the bedroom, but it held such sinisterness to it that I almost felt as though I'd piss myself. I heard first a single whisper, then another, until it became almost a deluge of overlapping whispers. I couldn't tell what they were saying, and I honestly am thankful for that. I already wake up in a cold sweat almost every night just from the inaudible whispers in my dreams already. And then a distinct whisper cut through them. "Daddy," it was a little boy's voice, and instantly, I knew it had to belong to Charles's son, because of his reaction. He stumbled forward more, and I heard him begin to sob. "Max," he whimpered out. "Join us, Daddy," I heard the whisper of a little girl call. The woman's voice spoke again. "It's so beautiful, Charles. Join all of us, so we can be a family." Forever I saw the man fall to his knees as the flickering shapes began to encircle him. "Charles, run!" I yelled out, still backing away slowly. But he didn't. Instead, he dropped to his knees, now loudly sobbing. I yelled at him again. "Charles, get the fuck out of there." At the same time, I heard Ralph yelling for me to run, but I was too transfixed on the sight in front of me. By now, I could see there had to be 20 or 30 of the shapes gliding out of the forest. In the front, I could see what looked like an adult woman-sized figure, and 2 smaller ones behind it. Oh, my God. I opened my mouth to yell for Charles to run again. But it was already too late. The 3 figures had reached him, while the others slowly closed the circle they'd formed around him. I couldn't hear the woman and children's voices whispering from the cacophony anymore, but Charles must have been able to, because he began crying out. "I didn't desert you. I told you I was going for help. I told you all to wait in the car." And then he tumbled onto the ground. Between the flickering figures, I saw him curl into a ball, could hear him sobbing loudly. The circle of figures had reached him, and almost as one they began to lean down over him. I couldn't tell what they did to him next, and I think I was blessed to not have. But I heard him begin to scream. It was the most frightened, pained, agonizing scream I've ever heard a man, no, a human being, ever let out in my life. It was as if you were being simultaneously burned alive, tortured, and slashed all at the same time. It felt like it lasted forever, though in reality it had to be less than 10 seconds. Then, all of a sudden, the screaming stopped. The whispering stopped. The forest went entirely still again, a deadly silence this time. I had frozen still at the man's scream, and barely letting out any breaths, I slowly brought up my right foot and stepped backwards, trying to make as little noise as possible. Crack! I froze as my foot came down on a branch, the sound of it breaking shattering the stillness. Oh, no! I knew I'd just made a terrible mistake. The figures had still been crouched over where they'd done, whatever they'd done to Charles. But now, one stood back up, turning to look at me. It was close enough now that I could see something, which, to this day, I wish I hadn't been able to. From a distance, I'd thought they had no visible eyes. But now, I could tell it did. They stood out among the flickering blue static, because they were as black as coals. As black as I felt the deepest pits of hell must look like. And they held a twisted, predatory look in them, the way a tiger might gaze at its next meal. "Oh, fuck me," I whispered out as more of them stood back up and looked at me, raising the revolver to point at them. I doubted that it would do anything to them, but I was not going to go down without a fight. That's when I heard a whisper cut through the rain. "Mickey," I felt frozen to the spot, and I swallowed hard. Ruthine. I forced out between my lips. I knew she wasn't anywhere near here. She was up the coast at her friend's house in Florence. And yet, I know I heard her voice. The British accent had been unmistakable. "Mickey, help me," her voice called out again. For a split second, I swore I saw her face appear out of the blue static in one figure's face, and I felt myself begin to cry. No, how is that possible? "Mick, listen to me, turn and run, my boy, before they get to you." Ralph screamed, his voice snapping me out of the trance-like state I'd been in. Ruthine's face disappeared from the figure, and I saw them begin to move towards me. I felt in control of my feet again, and I turned, feeling as vulnerable as ever, having my back to the things, and began sprinting through the grass, moss and muck. It felt like a mile to the hill, but a few seconds later, I slammed into the wet grass and began to climb, my fingers digging into and tearing away the ground at times. The revolver began to impede my grasp, and I dropped it, hearing it fall away back down the hill. I was halfway up, when I heard Ralph call again. "Climb, Mick. Don't look back, just keep climbing." For whatever dumb reason, I still don't know why, hearing that made me do the complete opposite and look down, back towards the bottom of the hill. And I screamed. All of the figures had reached the bottom, and were beginning to climb rapidly after me. One thing I could tell now as they used their hands to dig into the soil, was that their hands ended in what looked like black claws. "Oh, fuck my life," I screamed inside my own head. And then I felt a hand seize the collar of my jacket. I screamed louder as I felt something drag me up the hill roughly, until I was lying on my back in the mud of the dirt road. Ralph's terrified face appeared over me, and he reached his hand out. After a moment's confusion, I shot my own out and took it, being dragged to my feet by the old man with more strength than I ever knew he had. "Get back to the truck," he yelled, then shoved me forward. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and sprinted for the truck, hearing him following close after me. Grasping at the handle, I tore the driver's door open and hauled myself up into the cab, Ralph doing the same on the other side. We slammed the doors shut, and I reached down, grabbing the shifter in shaking hands and almost wrenching it into reverse. As I did, I glanced up and out the windshield. And screamed again. The Bentley was completely surrounded by the figures. There were even more now than there had been at the bottom of the hill. I don't know exactly how many, but I'd say at least 50 of them, if not more. They stood, their bodies shimmering as their cold black eyes watched us. Then they began to move forward. "Go," I heard Ralph weakly call out through ragged gasps due to running, and I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the thick, chunky off-road tires digging into the dirt and mud, shooting the truck backwards. Slowly, the shimmering shapes began to fade away in the distance. Why they never followed, I'll never know. Maybe they knew they couldn't catch us. Or maybe they'd already had enough with their prize, Charles. All I know is I kept my foot down, until I was able to turn the truck around, and then tore down the dirt road until we came back to the main road. I'm fairly certain I never let up off the gas until the two of us made it back to the station, where we both spent the rest of the night. The next morning, when the phone lines came back on, Ralph telephoned the police. He told them Charles had come through the station, asking for help. But, instead of telling the truth about taking him back, he strangely lied, something he didn't ever do, and told them he'd ducked back out after he'd refused, and headed back the way he'd come. When I asked him why he'd done that, he refused to say anything. The only thing he would tell me was this: "I've lived in this area for almost a century, Mick. The forests out here hold some secrets that should never be known. And they contain creatures that humans should never come across." When I pressed him how he knew about whatever those things had been, all he would say is that he'd seen them once before, many years ago, while out hiking with someone. He wouldn't tell me who. But the photo I've seen on his desk, one of a much younger version of himself, standing with his arm around a smiling young woman I've never seen before, one wearing an identical wedding ring to the one I've always seen on his hand, gives me an idea. The cops found the Bentley the next day, the doors still open as they had been that night. They found the footsteps leading down the hill. They even found Ralph's revolver, the sheriff giving it back to him a week later with a strange, knowing look. But they never found a trace of Charles, or his wife and children. I honestly knew they wouldn't. It's been almost 4 months since that hellish night. I'm still working for Ralph, as the man saved my life that night. I could never repay him enough for it. Besides, now he's hired someone else to run the tow truck when he or the mechanics can't make it out there. For that, I'm grateful. I could never step into the cab again. I tried once, but the memories of that night caused me to begin shaking uncontrollably. But, aside from that, things have slowly begun to get back to normal. Well, as normal as you can when you know there are things like them in this world. I know I'll never know what they are. And I honestly don't want to. I just hope over time, the horrors of that night will slide from my conscious memory. I'm back with Rudhine now, having convinced her to get back together. I don't tell her I hear the whisper of her voice calling to me from that shimmering figure, almost every night in my dreams. I honestly can't help but think often about Charles, and his wife and kids. Part of me hopes that they're simply all dead, long gone from this world in a place where they're together and at peace. Another part of me fears that out there, among the dozens of those things which search the forest for more victims, there are now 4 new shimmering, static-like figures which walk amongst them. 7th story. This story was shared by you/Bloodhunter62, so credits to him. Your friendly neighborhood Wendigo. Before I begin, I'm a 16-year-old male. About 3 years ago, I was in Virginia visiting family over summer. We were right outside the DC area and staying in a 2-story house near the freeway. On the other side of the freeway was a forest. So my mom, her boyfriend Eric, and I were all staying with Eric's parents. We had brought some night vision binoculars and decided that tonight was the perfect time to use them. So, after dinner, we gear up and head out. We pass under the freeway and head into the woods. When we get about 5 minutes into the forest, we set down our bag and take out our binocs. My mom looks around with them for a while, seeing a few squirrels here and there. She gets tired of them and passes them to me. I look around for a while, being careful not to look at the freeway for fear of being blinded. I spot something behind a tree about 50 feet to our left. I concentrate on it, trying to figure out what it is. It looks like a pale, bald anorexic man looking straight at us from behind the tree. I get a bit uneasy, but I'm hesitant to believe it's really there. I ask Eric to take a look, just in case. To my despair, he sees it too. He describes it much the same way I did. Now, Eric is a former amateur boxer and I train MMA almost every day, but neither one of us wants to stick around with that thing. We start heading back to the house, crossing under the freeway. We take another look behind us as a car comes by. All three of us see glowing eyes lit up by the headlights on the other side of the freeway. We say fuck that and head back to the house. When we get back, Eric's parents are asleep and my mom and Eric go upstairs to the guest room. There's only one guest room, so I have the couch downstairs. I'm a little too excited after seeing the thing in the woods, so I end up staying up all night. Around 3 a.m., I'm watching TV and start hearing footsteps above me. I immediately remember our earlier encounter and panic a little. I try to calm down and tell myself it's just one of the dogs or maybe someone who couldn't sleep. I keep hearing the footsteps for a while, until I hear a doorknob jiggle. I find it weird that they're trying to open a locked door, but try to ignore it. They stop, walk around for a few more minutes, and then it's quiet again. I stay up until the sun starts coming up and then pass out. My mom wakes me up and I remember the footsteps from the night before. I describe what happened and ask if one of them got up at any time. She says no, and I think it must have been one of the dogs. That is, until she tells me the room above me is the office. No one was in the office and the door stays locked at night. My heart sinks as I piece it all together. I don't know if it was that thing for sure, but I think it was. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to figure out what that thing was that night. I found two creatures that seemed to match it. I think it was either a skinwalker or Wendigo. Whichever one it was, I'm just thankful that door was locked. I know I wouldn't be able to fight that thing no matter how tough I am. 8th story. This story was shared by /SilverInkBlotV2, so credits to him. Wendigo. Norma Jean drew a heart on the back of my hand in hoop snake blood. When that fades, she said, tapping the center of her work, you may forget about me. Norma Jean and I dated on and off through high school and then some. We grew up wandering the forest and exploring the caverns surrounding Ripple Creek, running from the hide-behinds and hodags when we stumbled too far into their territory. The backwoods of Minnesota were our playground, from the shores of Loon Lake to the edge of Crazy Dan's property, where the pine trees grew so tall you couldn't see the sky. The day Norma Jean disappeared, I saw a teakettle scuttling around the shed behind my place. It walked backwards, like they do, and bumped right into the pile of wood I spent all day chopping. Teakettlers don't ever stray so far from the woods, they're very shy. I had planned to see about trapping it the next day, show Norma Jean, course, that didn't happen after all. I heard about Norma Jean the next morning, on my way to the general store for a new axe. The axe handle hounds got mine. Bunch of people everywhere, conversing in little groups, tittering like birds. They all stopped talking when they saw me, shuffled away when I drew near. I didn't say anything, something in their gaze made my voice feel as though it had rusted away. Finn was the one who pulled me aside. Said people hadn't seen hide nor hair of Norma Jean in 2 days. Birdie got worried after her car sat out on the road so long and called the cops. They went up to the Janeys and that's when they found the blood on the floor. Crazy Dan was already mumbling about hide-behinds to anyone who would listen. Not me, Norma Jean and I have been getting away from hide-behinds for years. Everyone's talking, but no one's actually saying anything. Lot of whispering about the Wendigo among the superstitious, more ordinary whispers from the less superstitious. One of the elders is a full-blooded Cree. I overheard a couple ol' biddies asking for talismans. Lots of narrowed eyes my way. I don't know what to say, the cops already interviewed me. I dated Norma Jean, but so did Aaron, Spruce, Hunter, Alder, Flint. Norma Jean was a pretty gal, milk-white skin, sky-blue eyes, corkscrew blonde hair. Any guy'd be lucky to have her on his arm. No one in Ripple Creek has slept easy lately, not with this hanging over our heads. I've had to buy 2 more axes in the last 4 weeks. I keep leaving them outside. The axe handle hounds must love me. I hear them barking the nights I forget to put my axe away, excited to have a free meal. Norma Jean would have laughed at me if she were still here. The thought brings the metallic taste of sorrow to my tongue. I remembered it in a dream, when Norma Jean and I went to Loon Lake Cemetery. There's no road out there anymore. You have to hike through the woods and over swampland that's just as likely to suck you down as it is to let you pass. Norma Jean always had a thing for the supernatural. They say there are 3 witches buried in that graveyard. If you step over one of their graves, they will come for you. 2 of the headstones are near the grove, the 3rd is missing. You really think there's a witch buried here? The weathered tombstones are nearly unreadable in the weak beam of my flashlight. Maybe Norma Jean rests on her haunches, tracing a finger over a name more than a century gone. Her blonde corkscrew hair is silver under the moon. She turns to me with a crooked smile. Are you afraid? The place did give me the shivers, even in my dream. But I wasn't afraid. No. She smiles a little wider. There are too many teeth in her mouth. Are you sure? I woke up with a pounding heart and a lump in my throat. My mouth tasted like blood, and I can't seem to scrub the feeling away. Mostly I just try to forget the whole thing. Forget I ever dated Norma Jean. It's alright most of the time. I chop and sell wood, and another winter passes. Then I see the hoop snake blood heart on the back of my hand and it all rushes back. The blonde corkscrews. Norma Jean and me. The hide-behinds and hodags. Norma Jean and Flint. The late nights and long hikes. Norma Jean and Alder. The axe handle hounds, swallowing my axe whole. Nineth's story. This story was shared by you/Northcoast10, so credits to him. I think I encountered a Wendigo. My wife and I have been running the rat race for years, with a family, a house in the city, 2 dogs, a cat, the stereotypical American dream. But the city took its toll, the neighborhood got worse, the crime rose, and we found ourselves looking for a way out. Our opportunity came when I was offered a new job out of state. It was a great career move, but we didn't want to move to a new city just to have the same problems again. So we started looking around and found a great mountain community about an hour and a half from the job, and a great ranch-style house with a big back porch, windows everywhere, and a lot of property. The backyard has a big grassy area, and a creek that cuts the property in half, then acres of woods beyond. It's huge. The house is more than twice the size of our house in the city, it's all updated, and has no neighbors within a mile. It's a radical change from the life we lived in the city, but best of all, it was less than half of what we were paying for our old house. The house was a foreclosure, and when we asked the listing agent about it, she simply said the old family had abandoned the property. We really didn't think anything of it. The first 3 months were uneventful, with us settling into our new life, the kids getting used to the new school and new friends, and most of all, us getting used to the big house and property. But then the weather turned cold and things started to get weird on the property. It started with noises from the back property. Things we chalked up to being in the woods, then the motion lights around the house started going off randomly. Once again we just chalked it up to being in the woods. But last night, it all changed. Last night was the most terrifying night of my life. one of the dogs was at the back door whining and scratching. I assumed he needed to go to the bathroom, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked out the back door. Instantly something felt off. The dog bolted for the back property, growling and snarling. It was a cold night, about 30 degrees, but the dog plunged straight into the creek and out the other bank, running off into the woods in the back of the property. Flashlight bouncing, I ran after him, calling his name. I got to the creek and made my way across the makeshift bridge, trying desperately to follow him. I could hear the dog still growling and barking from somewhere up ahead, and I pushed further away from the safety of the house and deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it. A shriek like I've never heard before in my life. It was a mix of a moaning wail and metal on metal. It echoed through the trees and then froze me in my tracks. My dog bounded its way back to me and cowered down behind me. I turned around and could just make out the warm glow of the house behind me, and the cold dark ahead of me. I swung my flashlight around wildly looking for the source of the noise. And that's when I heard an even more terrifying noise. Out of the cold silence, my wife's voice floated all around me. "Babe," the voice called out. I whipped back around and could just barely make out the image of my wife, safely inside our house. The voice called out again. "Babe, I'm right here," came the voice from deeper into the woods. Then came another voice, just as clear as the other. It was my dad's voice. "Come out here," it called. I swung the flashlight around again and this time caught the briefest glint of light bouncing off of eyes. The creature was in my beam of light for barely a second, but it was tall, maybe 6 feet, and ashen white. It had long spindly fingers that grasped the trunk of a pine tree, and then it was gone. I turned back and ran towards the house. I ran headlong into the icy creek and stumbled. My dog ran past me, making it back to the yard and up to the porch. I dug my hands into the freezing, muddy bank and pulled myself out, not stopping to look back. When I reached the porch, I scrambled inside. My wife ran over to me, asking what had happened. I just shook my head. I'm not certain myself what happened. I had a growing sense of dread tonight as the sun began to fall. We kept the dogs inside, and I haven't dared to look out the back. But as I sit here typing, one by one, my motion lights in the backyard keep going on. 10th story. This story was shared by /Chillinangodzillan, so credits to him. Wendigo encounter. Hi, so this is my first post on Reddit. I just wanted to share this story and see if something like this has ever happened to anyone else. Just to start off with some backstory. My group of friends had started making a nasty habit of joking about the Wendigo. My friend Stacy and me didn't for a while just due to the fact we believed in the supernatural, but after a few months it grew on us, and not knowing that the Wendigo can actually be triggered by such things, we joined in. Biggest mistake ever. I had just moved into the country, and we enjoyed making trips into town to have a few drinks, which is about a 30-minute walk from my place to town. At night, the first 10 minutes after leaving the bridge that leads out of town is pitch darkness with no street lights. After that, street lights are very sparsely places, which can cause for a very creepy walk back without anything happening. So with that all in place, let's continue. Stacy and I begin our night, walking into town. Get some beers. And have some fun. Shortly into the night, something slightly strange happens. We receive a phone call from her little sister at home crying and scared because she saw someone sitting on my friend Stacy's bed. She calms her sister down and asks her cousin to check her room for her sister at home. Everything is fine. No one's in the room. Also, ghosts and weird things happening at her house were very common, so a sighting like this was strangely regular. We continue our night. Into the night we meet a guy who seems pretty cool. He's riding a bike and tells us he's pretty drunk or something. We decide to hang with him for a bit, wanting to meet people in town. A ways into our hangout we are sitting on a park bench and the guy is laying on the ground in front of us. Suddenly my friend stands up and says it's time for us to go. I shrug and agree and we get going. After getting away from him, she tells me how the guy bit her ankle the day after she had teeth bruises on her ankle. Kind of flustered the guy would do that, we continue our walk out of town. Finally we pass the bridge, which is our last source of light for the next 10 minutes. We turn on our phone flashlights, and we turn on some music trying to ease the spooky feeling of being in pitch darkness in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly we hear a voice beside us. We both jump. It's the same guy on his bike. He asks us if he can follow us until we reach the fork in the road. We need to go left and he needs to go right. Still slightly creeped out, but almost at the street lights and the fork in the road, we agree. Regardless, he had to go that way and so did we. After a bit of walking we finally reach the fork in the road, and the first street light. We sigh with relief, hoping he would leave. But he turns down our way instead of going the way he needs to go. Now at this point we are thoroughly creeped out. We try to ignore it and keep walking, holding our breaths, wanting to reach the next street light, which is some ways away. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reach the next street light, which is also for some reason a small graveyard. I hate my area. Once we reach the street light, the guy stops dead in his tracks and doesn't move any further past it. As we turn around, the guy looks like he has suddenly passed out on his bike, his head down and shoulders slumped. I was about to say something to him, but my friend stopped me and said we really needed to leave him. I agreed, not wanting to be around him much longer either. After a few seconds I take a peek over my shoulder. He's gone, vanished. The worst part is, even if he had turned around and started pedaling as fast as he could, we still would have been able to see him some ways down the road. I panicked, but also slightly relieved he wasn't there anymore. We continue walking, trying to pretend we aren't creeped out. Walking quickly from street light to street light. Finally we reach my driveway. My driveway is a long road of darkness. We hadn't put any lights in yet to try and brighten it. We began to walk slowly, holding our breath, some weird feeling of dread coming over me the closer and closer we got to my house and the further into the drive. 11th story. This story was shared by /Darth Varda, so credits to him. A guy and his dog saved me from a witch and a Wendigo. Where do I even start? Benny. Benny's dead. And Goat. Shit, they're all dead. Except me. All because I had to piss. What the hell, man? We were out camping near Breck, thought we'd get one in before the snow settles over Colorado tomorrow. It was Goat's idea. He wanted to celebrate something. I can't even remember what it was at this point, and we all agreed that it would be fun, something to tell stories about later. I hate that we were halfway right. We hiked up with a bunch of gear and food and beer, and everything was great for the first few hours. But as soon as the sun went down and the darkness enveloped the mountains, things started to get. First, we thought that we were just too wasted, hearing things, and we all silently agreed to ignore it, pretending that everything was fine. But it finally got to the point where we just couldn't pretend anymore and decided that it would be better if we just left then and there. So, we began packing up. But I had to piss, and I said so before walking off into the darkness behind the trees, pretending not to hear the noises echoing up around the peaks, a mixture of laughter and screaming and a weird, piercingly high howling sound, like the wind knifing through the needles of the pines. That piss saved my life. I had just shaken off, when I heard him, sounded like Petey, saying, "Who the fuck are you?" And then a more insistent voice, maybe Jones or Goat. "Lady, are you deaf?" Then a concerned voice, Tim's. "I think she may be hurt." "Hey, are you okay?" Silence for a moment, and then someone shouted, and I couldn't identify the next voice I heard. "Hello, goodbye. Hello, goodbye. Goodbye." Confused, I peeked around the trunk of the tree, half expecting to see something fucked. And I did. There was an old woman standing near the edge of the firelight. She was wearing a yellowish rag, her hair hung lank and limp around her pallor face. Her face. It was disturbing. She was grinning from literally ear to ear, and her eyes were fully, deeply black. She looked like a fucking witch, an actual demonic being of the night. She laughed and then said, "Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye." Tim, Jones, and Petey were the first to go. They just burn up, in flames 7 feet high. Their screams were ungodly. I've never heard anything like them before, hope to never again. And the smell, fucking nauseating. I saw their skin bubble and slew off their bones in huge swaths of sinew and meat. The fire was so hot that all their blood just evaporated away with a sinister hiss. When the flames finally died down, 3 unrecognizably burnt bodies fell, shattering into ashes that blew away on the wind. Benny and Goat turned to run, and they almost made it too, but she pointed to them, and suddenly they stopped, freezing in place, their mouths open too fucking wide, their tongues lolling out. Somehow, someway she had stunned them, just by pointing. She cackled, it was gross, and looked over her shoulder. Out of the slits between the trees a hulking mass walked forward. The antlerman ran forward, towards Benny and Goat, snorting, screaming. He got to Benny first, impaling him on one prong and lifting him high into the air. Benny slid down slow, his mouth was open, but there was no sound, only a red-tinted thread of drool. Antlerman swung his head to the left and Benny flew off, hitting a nearby tree with a hard crunch. But he wasn't dead yet, and I saw him crawl forward, a stream of his guts trailing out behind him, steaming in the night air. Antlerman took 3 steps forward and stopped right next to Benny's head, lifted a hooved foot, and smashed it down and down and down, crushing his skull, stirring the brain matter up. And when Antlerman finally turned around, all that was left of Benny's face was a bloody pulp and one eye, perfect, unharmed, blue iris staring blankly up at the stars. Goat was next. He couldn't move, and I could see his eyes rolling around and around, wild with fear, trying to see if there was a way out. And then they stopped. Right on me. And I knew that he saw me hiding, watching. I moved back a bit behind the tree, peeking out, cringing as Antlerman took hold of Goat's arms, pulling and not stopping. I heard one resounding pop, then another, Goat's arms dislocating. But Antlerman kept pulling, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. I saw Goat's arms ripped right off his body, right fucking clean off, but he couldn't move, he just stood there, like some sick phallus, blood pulsing from both holes. Antlerman cocked his left arm back and sucker punched Goat right in the face, breaking his nose, sending him reeling backwards, and, before he even hit the ground, I could see that he was dead. Job done, Aunt Lerman turned back towards the witch and she shook her head, saying words that nearly made me shit my pants. There's one more, hiding, over there, watching. I think he's enjoying himself. Oh, what the hell, I shat myself. Why lie? I froze for a moment, unable to fight or flee. And then, there was this noise, mechanical, recognizable, and a guy wearing a goddamn ridiculous as shit gas mask bursts through the trees on a Ducati, headlights blaring, engine roaring. He came out of literally fucking nowhere. I blinked, ready to jump up, ready to run. But before I could, something soared over me, something big, four-legged, a dog. A huge goddamn dog. There was a booming noise and I realized that Gas Mask was firing a shotgun while the dog beside him barked. The blasts from the shots were amazingly bright and lit up the entire area with a severe fluorescent-like glow. Suddenly, the dog shot off, running low to the ground, straight towards Aunt Lerman, leaping up, latching onto his arm. Gas Mask reloaded, then swung the shotgun swiftly towards the witch and fired again, hitting her in the chest 4 times, making her stagger back, screeching. Next to her, the dog was ripping and tearing at Aunt Lerman, pushing him back towards the trees. Off the bike now, Gas Mask slung the shotgun over his back and grabbed a pistol from his belt, firing the whole clip, shouting, "Hocus pocus that, you bitch." And the witch fled. Aunt Lerman immediately followed. The dog charged off after them, baying loudly. I heard a loud, horrific bugle, like an elk dying, and something large crashed to the ground. Gas Mask whistled, high, low, in between, and, after a few seconds, the dog burst through the brush, panting, covered in blood and guts. It looked like it was grinning. It trotted up to the man and he leaned forward, patting it on the head once, twice, and I heard him mutter, "Good girl." I said, and Gas Mask looked up at me, like he forgot I was there. "Oh," he said, "yeah. Shit. You better run." Behind me, I heard the witch's laughter boil up again, weaker, wavering. The dog growled, crouching low, hackles high. The man pulled some shells from his pocket, reloaded, and cocked his shotgun, then repeated, "Run. We'll take care of this." And I did. I ran. And I fucking ran. Made it back to the car. Heard the shotgun firing behind me, and screaming, and howling. No laughter though. Currently on my way to report this. I hope to hell they'll believe me. But I don't even know if I believe what happened. That guy, that dog, that witch, and the deer. What just happened? 12th story. This story was shared by you/Kennard_Skinnerd. Thinking I've found a Wendigo cave or perhaps something worse. Looking for opinions. So I'm an avid caver from West Virginia, and there's this cave not far that's been one of my favorites to explore. It's often my go-to cave to take friends and newcomers to get them into caving, as it's a rather easy, accessible, and not too challenging cave, although it is a rather large cave system. The first thing to note is there's never any wildlife seen in or near the cave, and I've only ever seen very few bats for as large of a cave as it is. Anyway, the first really strange thing to happen was me and my friends stumbling upon a pentagram made of salt, with a dead bird in the middle, circled by some what seemed to be freshly burned out candles. Obviously it was freaky, but we took it to be a prank by some teens or something along these lines. I've always been very comfortable going through this cave and leading treks, but up until now I had always been with a group of friends. One day I decided to take my girlfriend through, so just me and her went. We didn't make it past the first chamber because I just had such an uneasy feeling and just felt as if I needed to get out of there. My way of describing it is the feeling of being watched, but on steroids. I've been in some sketch places, but I've never had that sense of dread in all my life. The next thing to happen is when a group of US friends went and stumbled upon a newer-looking jacket far back in the cave that was never there before. I wouldn't have taken it to be so odd, but it seemed to be a rather expensive jacket with no apparent damage or reason to just leave it laying randomly in this far back portion of the cave. There was also nobody else around at this time. The next thing to happen was when a group of us friends were exploring, and on the way back out, one of my most serious friends just seemed really strange and off. Finally, I asked him if he was good, and he nodded and quickly told me to just keep moving. Once we got out of the cave, he pulled me in private, which is really not like him, but he told me he didn't think it was a good idea to go back in there. I finally convinced him to tell me why, and he told me that he swore he saw a person back there. From what he could see, a very pale, lanky person. He couldn't quite make it out at first, but he said he noticed it following us. He even tried calling out a few times, but we didn't think nothing of him doing it at the time, as it's fun to yell and make echoes. Anyways, after this experience, I convinced the same friend to go back with me along with our other buddy to reach an extremely difficult place that I haven't been able to get to yet, seeing as I've been taking noobs. As we arrived at the cave, there was a man and woman camping nearby who were standing at the entrance. We made friendly convo and asked if they were going inside. They said no, they were just checking it out, so we then continued on. After reaching our goal and being at the dead end of a very tight spot, we laid and rested for a while. Then we heard people. We all heard it at the same time, as we looked at each other and squinted. We couldn't quite make out what they were saying as it was very distant and echoed and muffled, but we could clearly make out that it was English, male and female voices, and we heard laughter and water splashing. We thought it was pretty odd because it was in the AM and we didn't expect anyone else around but those two campers, so we figured it was them. Anyways, as we were exhausted, we rested for a good while longer and shut our lights off to save our batteries. We remained quiet as we were just resting, and after a while we couldn't hear anymore. Then we went ahead and made our way back out of the cave, and as we exited, the man and woman was still there by the entrance. My friend asked, "So you decided to go in after all?" The man replied, "No, why?" And we just asked if anyone else had went in or out, and they said they hadn't seen nobody at all the entire time. At this point we were creeped out as we all clearly heard voices, but we didn't really talk about it much among each other. Much later, while doing research, I started putting things together in my head and realized my friend's description as being very Wendigo-esque, and then I recalled how Wendigo are known for being able to imitate human voices to lure their prey, and it just really creeped me out. I almost wouldn't believe what he said he saw, but if you understood the person I'm talking about, he's not someone to ever just make up something like that. Anyways, I hope you found the read interesting, and I apologize for any grammatical errors, but I hope to hear some opinions or your guys' thoughts. Also, not really sure where the witchcraft would tie in, but it's definitely worth mentioning that I later talked to another caver friend of mine who, before I could even mention, told me they had found a pentagram similar to the one I found, in the exact same cave, at a different time. Edit. It's also worth mentioning I've recalled seeing a dream catcher looking thing near the pentagram, if it has any significance. 13th story. This story was shared by you/Jamie007dog, so credits to him. Well, I saw it. Hi. I don't really know how to start this post, it's my first one. At the time of writing this, I am living in western Pennsylvania, a little south of Pittsburgh. I was in Boy Scouts for most of my life, so I feel very comfortable in the woods and go camping often. Upon hearing Governor Wolf's school closure plan, I decided that it was time for some cold weather camping. It was March. It wasn't that cold, but it did drop to 40 degrees at night, and the people who I went weren't really avid campers. If you're from Pittsburgh, you may know the Boggs campsite on the Montour Trail. That's where we went. They, of course, only brought weed and alcohol and didn't bring any sleeping bags, blankets, or pillows, so naturally I assumed they were gonna have to sit by the fire all night. It was light when we first got there and the fire pit was still smoldering, very cool. We used the coals from the previous camper's fire to light ours, and immediately I knew that I would have to provide wood for the fire until I went to bed. They passed out beers at around 3 p.m. Times are gonna be a bit dodgy because I wasn't near my phone, and after having 2 to 3 beers I just wanted dinner. Now, that they did for me. They made ramen noodles and cheese, which was amazing. They had a weird name for it, and burgers over the fire. By this time it would have had to have been close to 5 p.m. because it started to rain a little bit, as was forecasted, so we took shelter in the lean-to shelter that was on site, and occasionally one of them would throw some sticks on the fire. Sticks were all they seemed to be able to find, even though I brought 2 saws and an axe, and I would cut up some logs. By the time the rain stopped, all 4 of us smoked a blunt and were sitting around the fire. I was light out, so we'll call it 7 p.m. After a while of just hanging out, they asked if I had any blankets. I always have blankets. Nothing special, but we've had some pretty bad snowstorms in the past, and a couple scratchy car blankets are always useful. They each got a blanket except for R, as we'll call him, who got my summer sleeping bag that I brought just in case. By now it was dark, 9 to 9:30 p.m., and the fire was getting low. I start off to find some more wood because they wanted to smoke another blunt. Now you have to understand that I'm 6 feet 5 inches and a semi-frequent user of the devil's lettuce, so my tolerance is kinda high. I return with the wood and we spark up another blunt, a smaller one, and just kinda hang out and talk and listen to music while we're high as shit. Good times. Eventually the fire, again, dies down a little bit, and, again, it's my job to get more wood. Because we had been there for a while and there were people there before us, most of the wood near the shelter was either really small or all used up, so I had to keep going farther and farther away from camp to find wood. 12:30 a.m., close to 50 degrees still, so we're all doing well. I have a flashlight, a really nice one that I use for scuba diving, that is kinda bright, so I use it on the low setting on land. At this point I'm far enough away from camp that my friends can't really see me. There's like an embankment between the Montour Trail and someone's driveway that you have to cross to get to more woods, but I'm comfortable alone because I knew what I was doing and they could hear me if I needed them. I start to hear a weird whistling sound, kinda like someone inhaling through a snorkel, but I chalk it up to the wind. The air was starting to get kinda cold, so I just took back what I had and put some on the fire. 1 to 2 a.m., 40 degrees with some wind, nothing severe. I have on 2 long-sleeve shirts and an army surplus coat that is super warm, but my friends are in windbreakers and hoodies, and, oh yeah, it's raining. Off to get more wood. This time I started taking into consideration the type of wood that I would collect. There was a lot of pine, but that burns fast, which is why I had to go collect it so often. The stretch of woods near the driveway was pretty much all pine, a few maples, but nothing big. So I keep walking knowing that this area has both conifers and deciduous trees in close proximity to each other. As I'm wandering and collecting wood, I notice that the rain has turned to a super fine snow. Time to head back, just in case it picks up. Then the whistling started again, a lot louder now. Okay, weird. There isn't any more wind than there was before. Maybe it changed directions. I keep walking. By now I can hear the music from camp and pick up the pace a little bit. Just as I summit the embankment and prepare to clamber down the other side, a loud noise echoes behind me. Tree fell? Shining my flashlight around, I couldn't see any signs that that was the case and didn't see any source. Deer knock something over? In my head it doesn't matter because I'm back at camp anyways and I can try the marsh behind our shelter next time. 3 a.m. They were cold. The temperature dropped to around 30 F and the wind and snow had picked up. Car blankets helped the boys a little bit, but they weren't able to go sleep in the tent that I brought without freezing, except for R, who slept like a rock all night after about 3:30. We decide to finish off the weed and give the last beers a good talking to. For 30 a.m. I'm about ready for bed at this point because I'm not super high or drunk or anything, but I was definitely tired. I offer to go collect more wood before I retire to my 0-degree sleeping bag and cot. I camp comfy when I don't have to carry it far, and they said they would join me. They must have been cold. We split up and I end up heading back to where I was before, except this time I left my flashlight on high and I made a bunch of noise to scare off that deer or whatever that was there earlier. I end up a little further away from camp than I had intended to be because there were only pine branches on the ground over here. Then the whistling starts again. This time I could tell the direction it was coming from, my left, and shine my flashlight around that area before just returning to collecting wood. Then the sound stops briefly, then picks up again in a different direction less than a minute later, this time in front of me and a little to the right, back into the pines. Maybe the branches of certain trees catch the wind just right and make the noise. I think whatever and move on. Then on my way back the noise was following me, darting from left to right, but always like right behind me. I don't see anything, so whatever. Then the noise makes like one sharp whistle and pauses, then I hear it. Damn, it's cold out here. It was R, but I couldn't find him with my flashlight, so I called, "Where you at?" and it sounded like he turned around because I heard a branch snap and a bit of movement. I pointed my flashlight at where the sound was coming from and I didn't see her anywhere. Maybe he's behind a bush or a tree or something. I call out again, "R," no reply this time. Yikes. He might be lost or something because we weren't at camp and he saw my flashlight moving, so he came to look. "R, where are you?" Nothing. Then, louder, "I'm going back to camp," because I thought he was trying to scare me. Shining my flashlight around one last time, I spot something dive into a bush about 40 feet from where I had heard her turn around. "I see you, big man. Grab some wood and come back." He's 6 foot and 230 to 250 pounds. I shine the light around for a few more seconds, then turn around again and start walking. The whistling is back. Cool, love that. No matter what speed I moved at, it always seemed the same distance away. I decide that I'd just kinda sit under a tree and wait for R to pass by because he had to come back sometime, right? I wanted to save the battery of my flashlight, so I turned it off and closed one eye, so it would adjust faster. By now the snow had picked up a good bit, which is another reason to stop, in case R got lost. I couldn't really see super far because there was a lot of cloud cover despite it being a full moon. The whistling never got closer, but it did start to move around a little bit, in a really odd circle. It would start in one spot, stop, then promptly start in another spot that was in a different direction. I realized that it had to be the wind or something because it was moving super fast and was moving at random. Cool, now where the fuck is R? I turn on my flashlight between whistles and call out again, "R?" It's important to note here that the whistling never picked up while I looked around. It normally only stopped for a second or two. It was super quiet. The snow was laying on the ground and we had 2 to 3 in on the ground by now, so maybe that muffled it? Anyways, upon not hearing her, I thought that maybe I missed him or didn't hear him at all and started to head back to camp. As I stood up and brushed the dirt off my ass, I shined the flashlight around one more time. I was thinking in my head I definitely heard him. After I stood up with the wood in my arms and began to walk back towards camp, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. My flashlight, being a diving light, has a wrist mount that I was wearing so I could use it and carry things. I turned towards and scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing, fucking deer. Not even 4 steps more and I saw another movement. Now the whistling was back. Damn, that gets annoying. Sounds like a fat guy who just ran up the stairs. Flashlight was on low so I could see maybe 40 feet around me and didn't see anything, but I knew it was time to pick up the pace. Now the whistling was followed by flashes of movement. Great, it's not the wind. At this point I am speed walking. Being tall I can move if I have to, and I was definitely traveling at jogging speed. A lumbering beast when he runs, could not move this fast or this quietly through the woods. Nice, another thing that it's not. I decided to turn off the flashlight and move into some brush that was close by. Not sure why, but I was getting a little weirded out and had the shakes even though I was warm. It was silent again. Well, fuck me, what is it? Is it hunting me? Coyote? Not a coyote. There was a good period of silence, then there was whistling. This time it wasn't doing circles around me, it was just moving around where I had turned off the flashlight. My eyes adjusted and I peeked out from under the bush that I was rolled up under. I tried. Nothing, just that damned whistling. By this point I was pretty much sober, like if I got pulled over I could nail the field sobriety test. I waited for a little while the thing just kinda looked around. Then I heard it speak. In a really garbled impression of me it called out, "Big man." It took everything I had not to panic. Holy shit. Not not human, not a deer, not the wind. Oh fuck. Then it spoke again, or cutting off really strangely like you just lifted the needle off of a record, but picking back up again with "back to camp" still in my voice. My fucking voice. I normally don't like hearing recordings of myself anyways, but now I really don't like them. It said a few more things, in different voices that I didn't recognize. All the voices were either talking about how cold it was or questions like "what was that" and "stop fucking with me," but they all seemed like whoever was talking had some phlegm built up in their throat. Then it went quiet. I poked my head out of the bushes again and saw something sitting against a tree in the same position I had been in, left leg straight out, right leg at an angle, hands behind my head. It could have fooled me as being we both kinda sit the same way, except his ADHD usually makes him fidget with his hands. Okay, so who's sitting in the woods with me? I lay there, silent, and just watch. It begins to whistle. So that's where that was coming from. It moves its hand around and a fist out in front of it, the same way that I look around with my flashlight, and then started to stand up. Oh fuck, it's tall. I only weigh 166, skin and bone mostly, so when I say that this thing was skinny, don't take it lightly. I could see how thin its long spindly arms were silhouetted against the snow that coated a bush behind it. When it stood up it was hunched over, not sure if I was slouching when I stood up, but I certainly do slouch. It walked a few paces away from the tree and stood up the whole way. Holy shit. I worked with backdrops for Threader Productions, and the walls we use the most are around 8 feet high, and this thing would have easily been able to see over one. I'm talking by at least a foot. It slowly peered around, no hair on its head, and its side profile showed a super disfigured skull. The jaw hung pretty far down and there weren't really lips that stuck out, but it was hard to tell because of how dark it was. It let out one final R. Big man, kinda like someone with tortures would say it, because they were just random words that it strung together. Then it screamed. My dad used to take me to air shows a lot as a kid, and this has to have been the same pitch and volume as an F-16. I couldn't move. It peered around, head just seemingly sweeping the area. Then it crouches down and leaps for a tree with the lowest branch being around 10 to 15 feet and lands feet first on one of the branches and sits there, squatting, whistling, and just staring around. Then it takes off. Faster than should be allowed in nature. I count to 10 in my head. The forest sleeps. I slowly make my way out from under the bush and begin to creep back towards camp, this time avoiding using my flashlight or making any noise if possible. I climb the embankment and take one last look towards the woods, unsure if that just happened or if I was asleep. I tumble down the other side of the embankment and return to the relative safety of the big-ass fire with Y and J, the other two who went for wood. "Where's your wood?" asks Y. "Oh, it had bugs. It's finally got a lot anyways." They stacked up a solid pile of oak and pine, not enough for the night, but enough for a little while at least. "Where's R?" I ask warily. "Check the tent there, he was passed the fuck out snoring the way he always does." "Well, okay then." I climbed into my sleeping bag to warm up a little bit because I was covered in snow when I got back, and it screamed again. "Oh, please don't tell me it's coming here." The other two looked at me wide-eyed. Normally if I recognize a sound I say what it is out loud so they know what's up. I had no response. They asked if I heard the first one. Good, they heard it too. I answered with a nod as I unlocked the car in case we needed to book it. They asked if I saw it. Nod. What was it? No fucking clue. I described it to them quietly so that I could listen for more noises, and I told them about it imitating my voice. Y was pretty freaked out. Jay thought I was bullshitting him and said it was some kind of owl. I got out of my sleeping bag, threw my coat back on, and joined them at the fire. For the first time in a while I looked at my phone, 5:45 a.m. We looked up native owl calls and came up empty-handed. The same happened with every other animal we tried. Jay seemed a little nervous. Y suggested that maybe it's a truck on the highway. Yeah, that's probably it, I replied blankly, and Jay gave me a look that said that he knew it probably wasn't. They didn't sleep. I forced sleep upon myself so that we wouldn't die on the car ride home. The next morning we went for a walk. It didn't snow much after I got back, so you could kind of follow my footprints. The tree the thing leapt into was out of reach of me on Jay's shoulders. R was still asleep, but I think I might have been able to reach it if I was on his. The tree I sat under had scratch marks on it. I think they're from deer shedding the velvet off of their antlers, but it creeped me out nonetheless. The tree it sat under had footprints everywhere. There seemed to be no order to them at all. It was amazing. It looked like it had run over every square inch of that area, coming as close to the bush I was in as 2 me lengths. I don't really know much about cryptids or anything, but when I got home I googled North American tall skinny cryptid, and the second result was from Parade, a list of cryptids. After ruling out everything else on the list, I came across the picture of a Wendigo that has antlers. Not quite, but pretty close, described as tall and skinny and super fast. I did my research and every picture has antlers, but I can't find any evidence that, other than a few movies, it had antlers. IDK. What I saw definitely didn't have antlers, but it matched everything else, even down to the whistling. 14th story. This story was shared by you/Annie the Bonanny, so credits to him. I heard him at my window. I need to explain two things before I tell this story. First, I have a sleep disorder and I've had it my whole life. I sleepwalk. Nothing too dramatic, mostly just do everyday things while sleeping, open the fridge, put clothes in the washer without starting it, take the vacuum out of the closet and set it in the middle of the room and leave. That sort of thing. When I was younger this was an every night occurrence, but now in my late 30s this is a once/twice a year thing. Second, I am native. I have a healthy respect for the stories of spirits my ancestors told. Many hunting trips I would sit around the fire with my dad listening to him tell stories of the tricks Wendigo play to try to lure you to them. While I'm unsure if I believe the stories of skinwalkers and Wendigo, I don't tend to mess around. Just in case. Shoot to roughly 3 weeks ago. My husband and I both work construction. We have hard, long and rewarding days. Once dinner is over and planning for the next day is complete, the dogs have been taken out for the last time, our heads hit the pillows and it's lights out until the alarm sounds. We sleep like the dead. Pretty sure a war could break out in our bedroom, thundering tanks and all, and we would sleep right through it, wondering in the morning where all the holes in the walls came from. Our bedroom is fairly good-sized and has a small bay window in the corner. My husband liked to sleep with fresh air, so he takes the window side of the bed. This particular night though, something woke me up. I never wake up. Dogs were quiet. Typical northwest weather, rain quietly taping away, no thunder, no heavy winds. I looked the dark and quiet room over and nothing was out of place. The only noise besides the rain was my husband's box fan gently humming away. I was confused but decided to adjust my blankets, flip my pillow and go back to sleep. As I closed my eyes and took a deep breath to relax, I heard my husband, "Babe, come out here and give me a hand with the boys." Confused and still foggy from being woken from a deep sleep a few seconds earlier, I opened my eyes to the pitch black of the room again. Rarely one of our 3 dogs will need to go out at night, and if one goes they all will go. We live in an incredibly rural area, and it's easy for them to get lost in the dark woods. Not a good thing when you have bears, coyotes, cougars and whatever else on your property. Babe, can you come out here and help me with the boys?" He called again, voice right against the half-open window, not concerned, just demanding. Annoyed and groggy, I leaned up, propping myself up on a stiff pile of blankets to look at the window. It was too dark to see him. The floodlight is on the other side of the house. "Babe, come outside," my husband demanded. It was the third beckon that bothered me. He was never that pushy. If something was wrong, one of the dogs wandered off, he would say that. It's happened before. He would something like, "Come watch these 2 real quick, I can't find Murph," something like that. Something wasn't right. I was regaining my focus and shaking off the sleepies, quite awake at this point. I knew it was him. My husband has a very distinct voice. He's a Sicilian from Queens and has a very deep, unintentionally loud voice. It was at that moment, staring out the black window, I realized I wasn't leaning on a pile of blankets. The pile of blankets was breathing. I was leaning on my sleeping husband, listening to him call to me from outside the window. "Babe, come outside." The voice came again from the window. I put my hand down on my husband's face. He was there, asleep next to me. But his voice, or what I thought was him, was at the window. I laid down next to him, very, very close to him, and closed my eyes very tight. In moments like these, I'm the type to just try and pretend it's not happening. I didn't hear it again and spent the next half of the night trying to fight off the spookies, and had at some point finally fell asleep. I told my husband about it the next morning after his "oh my god you look like death" comment. I hadn't slept well. He laughed it off as I had probably had a creepy sleepwalking thing. Thing is, when I have a sleepwalking event, I remember nothing. I don't recall dreaming, walking, or anything from those nights, no matter how hard I try. It's like a blackout. I am sure I was awake for this. Every time I think of it these past few weeks, I remember those hunting trips, poking coals around in the fire with a stick while my dad tells his serious yet animated tales of Wendigo tricks to get you to come to them. I know it sounds crazy, but I think there's a Wendigo in my woods. 15th story. This story was shared by u/England lover, so credits to him. Wendigo. I've posted a story about this before and I'll copy it in this, but I really want to know what's going on in the woods. I thought it was a Wendigo, but now I'll share my new experience after the old. I live in a small town in the country. There are more cows than people, and some of the buildings are really old. This happened when I was about 8 years old, and this is the first time I've brought myself to tell this story, and I only have the courage because I'm far away from the trees. I lived in a valley, and the woods surrounded our house on all sides. Now, my entire family has lived in these valleys and hills for generations, and there are countless stories of paranormal things happening to all of us. Several strange things have happened to me, but this is one of the most terrifying. So, living in a small town in the middle of nowhere, there wasn't really anything to do other than hike. I loved hiking and would repeatedly walk in the woods for hours. There was an old story that my great-grandmother told me of a creature that lived in the woods and would stalk anyone who entered. As a kid I thought, yeah right, it was probably just a trick of the trees or something. But this day I stayed out a little later than I intended to, and it started getting dark. Turning back, I began to walk towards my house when I heard a noise behind me. It wasn't uncommon to see a chipmunk or a bird, but when I turned around there was nothing there. Shrugging it off, I continued, but the sounds got louder and louder. You could hear the leaves rustle and the branches snap behind me. I began to get scared. You always hear those stories of kids being kidnapped because they're alone, so I began to run. Not the smartest, because I tripped over a branch and fell, skinning my knee pretty bad. Turning around quickly, I thought I was done for, but there was nothing behind me, just trees and leaves. It was dead quiet, even the wind wasn't rustling the leaves, and there wasn't a single bird singing. Feeling pretty silly, I got up, brushed myself off, and turned to walk the rest of the way home when I saw it. To this day I don't know what it was. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer. I live in the country and I know what they look like. This thing was in the distance staring at me. It was covered in fur and had these piercing white eyes, and what looked like horns or antlers were protruding from its head. It knew I saw it because it smiled, and I swear all of its teeth were sharp fangs. I instantly wanted to scream and run, but when I looked into its eyes I was frozen. I couldn't even blink, let alone scream. I could only stand there dumbly as it got closer and closer. The closer it got, the more bony it looked. Its limbs were long and it looked starved. It stank like rotting flesh, and I felt like crying, but I couldn't. I honestly thought I was done for until it stopped. Its head tilted and it just looked at me, then turned and walked away. When it left I could move again, and when I thought I could walk without falling I ran home. I shut myself in my room and bawled my eyes out for hours. I didn't go back in the woods for years, and even now I'm wary of it. I don't know what it was or why it was there, but I got the message loud and clear: stay away. That happened well over 10 years ago and was really the only major experience I had in the woods. Until recently. Now growing up, I've seen more strange things in the woods than I can count. But most of them aren't anything to be concerned with, except recently something dark has been moving in the woods. It looks like a man sometimes, but will change shape. It ducks in between trees and hides just on the edge of where the woods are. I thought I was crazy, but my close friends have seen it too. This thing seems to give off an evil feeling. One of my friends were pushed down the hill and swears that she saw this dark entity out of the corner of her eye when it happened. Another of my friends swears they heard laughter coming from the trees. This thing gives me the creeps. I'm not sure if this shadow man is the same creature that I thought was a Wendigo or not, but it definitely isn't friendly. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.